My name is David. I've been a quality regulatory consultant for the last almost decade now, and a lot of the work I do is with smaller companies, larger companies, doing both regulatory and quality, because I felt that early in my career that, having one knowledge base without the other was a little bit difficult. So essentially what I do nowadays in my day job is I work primarily with two groups. One of them is combination products, so working on drug delivery, regulatory, so submitting new drug applications, INDs. And the fun part about that is my background was originally medical devices, but with these drug applications, it's hilarious working with multi-billion-dollar pharmaceutical companies that have no idea how to manufacture or develop a medical device. So my job is to essentially get them through the regulatory process, and one of the tools that I use to my advantage is what we'll be talking about today. On the other side of things, I also work in the digital health space. So I started a company called RemindTrack, which is a company that does medication adherence tracking, and also have dealt with several companies doing digital health 510Ks, which is a fairly new paradigm. So today you'll hear me reference those two types of products often, but I've also worked with several other general health, hospital, anesthesia, urology devices as well. And I'm really happy to have my good friend here, John. We've collaborated a couple times on quite a few things. I'm a big fan of Greenlight.Guru, their platform, because it makes my life easier as a consultant. But not to plug that, I just want to let John give you a little introduction as well.
Oh, sure. And I'm a walker, so when I talk, I walk. So hopefully that's okay. As long as the guy in the back is able to track with me, we're good to go. But welcome. We're going to thrill you and excite you this morning on pre-submission. So I hope you all have some exciting questions to stump David. So if not, think of those questions now, because he likes to be stumped. So that's your challenge for this morning. But my name is John Spear, and I'm the founder at Greenlight.Guru. I'm also the VP of Quality and Regulatory. A little bit of background about myself. I actually started as a product development engineer. I've worked with many physicians who would draw concepts and sketches of products on a cocktail napkin sketch, literally, and hand it to me and say, hey, can you design this? And so through my career, I've been in this space for about a little over 18 years. I've been able to bring over 40 products to market, but at somewhere along the way, I shifted and became enthralled with this thing called design controls. And what is that all about? Because I saw companies struggle with that, engineers struggle with it a great deal. And in my mind, I was starting to get more into like systems orientation and quality systems and so on. So I started to shift to what engineers may think of as the dark side. I shifted one of the dark sides. Engineers, how many of you are engineers? So engineers, there's a lot of dark sides from engineering. Sales, marketing, quality, regulatory. Sometimes those are all different dark sides in the med device space. But yeah. I shifted more towards quality systems and just got excited about that if one can do so. And then as David mentioned, his shift to moving more towards regulatory, that was other skill set that I gathered as well, just to have the complete holistic picture, take on the regulatory space and learn about things like 510Ks and technical files and pre-submissions and IDEs and all of the things that we need to do, because that's ultimately what we're after, is getting our products cleared into the market. And so David and I, we've put together what I think is a pretty fantastic program for you today. I guess you'll be the judge of that. It's as good as your interaction, so when you have questions and comments for us, please raise your hand, ask your questions, because you pay good money to be here. This is a workshop. David and I can talk for days if you let us, and we will. But if you want this to get value out of this, please engage, interact. Sound fair? Okay.
Good deal. Thanks,
right,
John.
And I'm going to sneak in here and grab
this. Coffee. So who's heard of a pre-submission? Anybody? Well, that's good. So there's some clarity. Who's been involved in actually doing a pre-submission? Great. Anybody in the quality or regulatory fields? What are you guys' roles here? Regulatory, perfect. Quality, perfect. So some background in the room. So some of this might be a little preliminary for you, but we're going to get really in depth as we go through this. So we'll talk today for approximately 3 hours, but we'll hopefully get past that a little bit. And we're going to go through quite a few things. We're going to go through defining a pre-submission. What is a pre-sub, right? We keep talking about this pre-submission, pre-sub. We'll go take breaks throughout because it's a lot of stuff. You know, we're going to be going through a lot of stuff today. We'll do a case study. So John will walk us through a case study of a pre-submission. And then at the end, we're going to build our own pre-submission. All right, so a couple of disclaimers. Anybody know who that is up top? Man, you got a really good prize if you tell me who that is. All right, I'm going to go through the disclaimer, and then you tell me who you think it might be. So in the QA/RA world, there's always best practices, there's multiple perspectives. So a disclaimer I always like to say is that this is based on our personal experiences. Obviously, we will cite statutory, regulatory, and quality requirements as we go, but a lot of it is best practice. So just understand that we're trying to get you also everything except for some of the caveats here and there, which we'll mention. So we'll give you, we're going to take this as kind of the 80-20 principle, right? We'll give you most of the bulk of the information you need to know. There's always caveats in this world. Always be aware of that. But anyway, that's our goal. So now that I said 80-20, anybody know who that is? Come on, we're all engineers. Pareto principle, Wilfredo Pareto. Come on. Alrighty. A couple of other requests. So because we wanted to make this actually useful and not be up here speaking for 3 hours about philosophy, right? That's what I hate. I go to conferences and somebody gets up there and looks, there's a regulation and they say, the manufacturer shall establish design. It's like, well, we don't want that. We know that. We can read that paragraph online. So we put a lot of information from previous submissions. I've redacted a lot of it, obviously, for protection of our clients. But just to be clear, please don't post this on social media and all that because, although my clients have been very graceful in allowing me to use their information, they also don't want it to be just publicly available except for the video that we'll show. And then last thing, since this talk focuses on the pre-sub, we're not going to get into the details of an actual 510K and how to do a 510K, but obviously there's a lot of analogous information on those. So we'll cover some of that as we go, but really we're going to focus on that pre-sub part. And then the last little disclaimer I'll tell you is it's going to be like drinking water through a fire hose today, that old Caltech analogy. A lot of stuff coming at you. I'm Cuban, I'm loud, I'm obnoxious, I'm ENTP, which one of the bad things about ENTP is they're obnoxious, and I have to acknowledge I am. So please cut me off. Please tell me you have a question. Please shout at me. Literally mean this so that we can, communicate. This is ineffective if I'm here talking at you for the next 3 hours with John. Okay? Please. Alrighty, let's get started. So what is the whole pre-sub thing about? I wish there was a way for FDA to give me a heads up about my submission before I get there. Who wishes they had that? All of us, right? So anybody worked on a 510K or PMA in the past or other regulatory application? Anybody ever got these silly things like a refuse to accept acknowledgement that basically your 510K wasn't full enough or didn't have the proper information? Or even if you submitted, you're going through and then 6 months later, they request more data. Anybody think that's a pain? That's a pain, right? Obviously, it costs money, costs time. So I really wish there was a way to just call up FDA and say, hey, guys, this is what we plan on doing. What do you think? Anybody think that exists? Well, obviously, yeah, it's a loaded question, right? That's the whole purpose of a pre-submission. It's not quite as easy as saying, hey, guys, what's going on? We're going to do this. What do you think? But it actually is a lot easier than you think, and that's what we're going to be covering today. So the pre-submission is basically under an umbrella term called the Q submission or question submission. This is a process that evolved from another process, which we'll go over here shortly. But really, question submission is a way to obtain feedback from the Food and Drug Administration on planned medical device submissions, as well as other drug submissions, which has its own separate process. There's some tangential relationships there that I'll point out as we go. Because are any of you working on combination drug delivery products or combination products? No? Okay, so less important. Anybody working on digital health products, mobile health products? Man, you guys are just working.
Anybody have a device that has an app to their smartphone that's going to communicate data? All right, so you're working on a digital health.
Go. Yeah. Okay, good. All right, so we'll go through some of those examples. So, makes sense what the Q submission process is. Literally just think question, submission. We got questions about our submission. It's that simple, that FDA hopefully will address. So the Q submission has a couple different categories. There's a few parts to this. There's what's called an informational meeting, which is just like it sounds. You meet with the FDA, you present information. It's almost like a hey, we exist type meeting. Agreement meeting, that's a little bit out of scope for today, which we won't discuss. And there's other types of categories of Q submissions. Study risk determinations for non-significant risk devices, submission issues, day 100 meetings for PMAs, for pre-market approvals. But today what we're really going to focus on is this green one called the pre-submission, which is a separate category. And it's called a pre-submission because it's pre-510K, prior to a 510K. And we'll go through what that is in a second here. So the pre-submission process expanded out of another process. Obviously, FDA is always iterating, always coming up with new approaches, called the pre-IDE program. So the pre-IDE program is fairly old now. It was emerged in 1995, and it has transitioned into what's called the pre-sub process, which the most recent guidance emerged in 2014. So the reason that this happened is because the FDA wanted to expand the types of submissions, questions, and conflicts, or not conflicts, or discussions between manufacturers and the agency. So they expanded the scope to include several different aspects of medical devices within the MEDUFA amendments, the Medical Device User Fee Amendments of 2012, which was under the Umbrella Affordable Care Act. So that was the purpose of that expansion.
So I'm just curious, how many of you, prior to this pre-submission guidance that came out in 2014, how many of you actually put together a 510K or worked on a 510K in the late 90s, early 2000s? Did you ever use the pre-IDE as a vehicle to try to communicate to the FDA? Yeah, it was such it wasn't really useful as a tool to industry because, IDE, Investigational Device Exemption, as the name would imply, I'm going to submit a pre-IDE prior to doing an IDE. But there were some companies that were using that pre-IDE as a vehicle to ask questions about the FDA. So I think this is a great case where, hey, FDA observed, they saw how industry was trying to communicate with FDA, and they did something about it.
Yeah, good point. Thanks, John. So what they did about it was create this guidance and this process. And if you look at it, it's just pretty straightforward. The pre-submission program and meetings with Food and Drug Administration staff. I mean, that's literally the scope of the guidance document. So what this is basically what you need to know in a nutshell. Honestly, even if you fall asleep the rest of this talk and you go back home and you review this, you're probably gonna get like 75% of the information. But that 25% is definitely worth your money, guys, I promise. So just stick with me for a second, okay? But really, this guidance is well written, right? And I have to say, in general terms, a lot of the Food and Drug Administration guidance documents that have emerged over the last few years have been very well written. A little bit more on the vague side, like usual, but they've been very clear on certain aspects that people always ask about. And one thing I really like about this guidance is it actually gives you a rough format for doing this process called the pre-submission. And we're going to go through some examples today of that. So nobody works on combination products or drug delivery devices, but maybe you will, right? That's approximately, it looks like 37% of products over the next 2 years, new products will be combination products. So that's always a good sign to maybe take a look at that, expand your vocabulary when it comes to regulatory and quality. So on the drug side, there's a separate guidance called Formal Meetings Between FDA and Sponsors or Applicants. And what I'll be doing today as we go through this with John is basically giving you a behind the scenes of not only the device side, but sometimes when you have a drug device combination product, what you need to do for the device side of that product. So just remember, devices, you got this bad boy, and then drugs, you have this guidance, okay? Which actually preceded the formal guidance that we looked at for devices. So, what is a pre-submission? We talked about what a Q submission is. What's a Q submission? What does Q stand for? And what is a question submission? Basically a formal meeting with the Food and Drug Administration, right? FDA, right? Okay. So what is a pre-submission? What's that subset of a subset? Well, it's a formal written request from an applicant or sponsor, a manufacturer, right? Somebody who's looking to do a 510K, to be provided in the form of a formal written response by FDA. So questions from the applicant sponsor, answers by the FDA, and the feedback is documented in meeting minutes. Now, a lot of you will probably work at companies where you probably hire like a scribe or some sort of admin to do your meeting minutes, and it's like, well, this is kind of like an oversight. Nobody's ever going to look at these minutes. These minutes are the treasure trove. It's the reason you're doing this thing. And we'll focus on those meeting minutes towards the end of the conversation today, but it's very critical. Those meeting minutes have been used by my clients to secure $3.5 million. Those meeting minutes have been used by my clients to debate a refusal when they went to do a 510K that had previously been noted in the pre-submission. They use that as evidence that the FDA reviewer had told them something different, and that's a tricky situation, which we'll talk about as well. But those meeting minutes are gold. You spend all that money and time, 60, 75 days, to emerge with some meeting minutes. And we'll go through what that means.
I mean, think about it. I mean, we probably have all dealt with regulatory bodies where they give you some feedback or some comments, and they give you that famous disclaimer. Everything we say now is not binding. You know, we reserve the right to change our mind at a later point in time, which for those of us that are trying to get certainty and clarity, and certainly direction, we're seeking as clear of information as possible. And now, as David said, there are a few caveats here, but those meeting minutes are important because they are a collection of what you heard and what FDA heard, and there's an agreement from both sides that this is what was discussed as part of this pre-submission. So take those meeting minutes very seriously.
Yep, and we'll go through how to do that at the end here. So again, just to kind of hammer down the point, pre-submission, stuff we want to know to help drive our R&D program, our development program, our quality strategy, our regulatory strategy, so we can make this part easier, the submission, the 510K. Just drill that in your brain. That's really what the pre-submission process is. So what we're going to focus on today is the pre-submission process as it applies for pre-market notifications or 510Ks, okay? So you can use the pre-submission process for several submissions or related applications, like an IDE, right? John was talking about an investigational device exemption. It's kind of the medical device equivalent to clinical trials, if you will. We'll kind of leave it at that. Drug biologic submissions, INDs, BLAs, things of that nature. Pre-market approvals, which are obviously a lot more lengthy in time, right, and effort and money to get to market. Those are always very important. We're going to focus on the pre-submissions for pre-market notifications, 510Ks today, okay? So should I do a pre-sub? That's the first question. So when I meet with a client, I just had a meeting, 3 months ago. A new client actually in the area in Carlsbad. And, you know, they came to me and they said, hey, you know what? We have this product. We've kind of done a little bit of a regulatory research on it. Here's a couple of concerns we have from the development side because our predicate device, the device that we're using to essentially compare our device to, has these key differences. And as they talked, I already had the answer formulated in my head. I said pre-sub. And you know, it's almost like something a lot of my clients make fun of me because I'm such a proponent for this process. But hopefully at the end of today, you'll learn why I'm such a proponent of this process. The pros are really clear. I mean, even let's forget about your regulatory and quality strategy. You always want to form a relationship with the FDA early and often, right? This is a great way of doing that in a very structured environment. For example, I'm best buds with my regulatory project manager on one of my client submissions. We're not best buds, we can't be, but anyway, we do communicate often. We trade, discussions, we have conversations. That's a good way of forming a relationship with the FDA off the bat. So that's one of the big pros. De-risk your submission. There's nothing like doing a 510K, getting to the end of the line, submitting it, and getting back feedback saying, the FDA has the following concerns about your application, this, and this, and then it's more time, more money, more effort. You would be surprised at how many of those common mistakes can be addressed in a pre-sub, okay?
I mean, think about it another way. I mean, a lot of cases, if you do not utilize a pre-submission vehicle, but instead you just go straight to the 510K, does the FDA have any knowledge what you're doing at all? I mean, imagine if the first communication that they have about your new thing that you want to get cleared in 90 days arrived on their doorsteps in the form of a 510K submission, right? This is why this is such a powerful vehicle, such a powerful mechanism, because as David has indicated, this allows you to have that dialogue, the interaction with the FDA. I mean, old school thought was put together the 510K, kind of throw it over the wall, cross your fingers, hope you don't get any questions. And you always do, because the FDA's job is to protect healthcare consumers. And if there are things that are not clear in that submission, or they're not really sure what you're doing, that's kind of the bad time to find out.
Yep, no, it's a very good point. And that de-risking is not just from a regulatory or quality perspective. If you're a startup, what's the one thing that you are always low on? Money, right? Cash. So, quick example, last year I did a pre-submission for a drug-device combination product where one of the big concerns was demonstrating something called bioequivalence and bioavailability, aka if I have a device that delivers the same drug as another device that delivers the same drug, will they deliver it in the same way? Will that drug be metabolized the same way? Will the drug the pharmacodynamics be the same? Will it be absorbed by the blood the same? All those type of questions, that was a big concern. And to do that type of test, a BEBA study, anywhere from about $500,000 to $1.2 million. Okay, so it's not a trivial amount of money when a lot of companies are raising, $1 to $2 million in a Series A round, right? So we met. I looked over their files. I took a look at some of their documentation. I said, you know what? Let's just ask the agency. Let's put together a plan for why we don't believe that we need to do this study with proof, which will become very evident here in the future, here soon, and let's see what they say. And long story short, although the FDA will often not tell you, no, you don't have to do that, because a lot of the things are reviewed at submission time, right? There was very positive feedback and strong hinting, okay, that was not a necessity for the company, and saved them, again, almost $1 million right off the bat. So it's de-risking on all fronts. Confirming assumptions, right? Sometimes you think it's the most straightforward 510K, and it's not. FDA reviews of submission materials. One of the cool things about this pre-submission process that has emerged that was learning experience for me was how many times the FDA has said, hey, you know what? Thanks for coming over here. When you guys are done with your human factors summative validation study, come back to us and show us the data. We'd like to take a look at it prior to your submission. You guys want to review, you want to be a reviewer on our stuff? Yeah, absolutely, we'll do that. That's really cool. Think about it. You really have basically no longer a core team at your company. You have a core team that consists of an FDA reviewer who's going to be reviewing your submission, who's going to take a pre-look at your stuff. That's really key and really informational.
I had a chance to talk to Allison Komiyama.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
Allison, for those of you that know her, she's now a consultant, but she used to be a reviewer at the FDA. She used to get 510Ks and review them. And, realize FDA reviewers, they're humans. They're people too. They want your technology to save and improve quality of life. And so the more you can engage them in that process, FDA reviewers love how great they feel when a device that they were a part of that review team actually gets to the market and actually makes a difference in the world. So keep that in mind.
Yeah, absolutely. So what are the cons? So we keep saying these pros, right? All right, money, right? So I don't work for free. So when I do a pre-sub for a client, it'll be a little bit of money, not that much, not as much as you think. Time, right? From time of submission to time of receiving your final meeting minutes can be anywhere from 60 to 90 days. They try to target that 60 to 75 day time period. So if you are really itching to get to market next month, it's probably not going to be good for you. And then the question that I always get, and I'm gonna leave this to you to answer. They say, well, but David, how about if they tell us that strategy, no, we don't agree with that strategy, or we don't agree with that approach? What would you say to them? That's exactly what I respond. I go, hey, you know what? Better to know now than later, right? And it makes sense, right? Think about that. So in terms of the cons, just do it. I mean, honestly, if you guys are in part of your quality regulatory programs within your companies, make the pre-sub part of your process. There are no cons that I can think of to make this something not to do, okay? So, David, you're a consultant. You make money off of this. John, you're on greenlight.guru. You make money off of this sometimes. So why should we listen to you? All right, don't listen to me. Listen to the FDA. This is what they said. So if you read through that, the key bottom line here is that when the FDA, and anecdotally from talking to several reviewers, receives a pre-submission, typically most of these submissions are not rejected for minor things, like things in the refuse to accept checklist. Their regulatory strategy is more sound. The quality of the data is effectively much better than other submissions. Again, there's no reason, if the FDA is practically begging you to come to them early, not to do it, okay? So why submit a pre-sub from the business perspective? We've gone through a couple of these already. Establish a relationship with the FDA. If you are a new company, you have no idea how fun it is sometimes to go to the FDA, in DC basically, and sit down with them and play show and tell with them. Like, here's a new device, we're a new product. They get so excited. Again, they're humans, right? They're people. People think that the FDA is this whole bad, ugly governing body. No, I don't know why. I think people who don't deal with the FDA on a daily basis have that opinion. I deal with the FDA on a daily basis, and it's really a fascinating and fantastic group to work with generally. So I really think that getting them involved early from a business perspective, acknowledging who you are, is very critical. De-risking your regulatory strategy and assumptions, we talked about that. That's one of the biggest issues. I had a client 3 years ago. I sat down with them and I said, hey, you guys, this actually seems like a pretty good target. Your product, is pretty well known, pretty well respected. There's not a lot of adverse events associated with this product. It's been on the markets since, similar products have been on the market since the 1970s. So you have actually a special guidance document for yourself. This actually might be a good candidate for an abbreviated 510K, which less than 20% of 510Ks are candidates for those. They sat down and said, no, we have another consultant. They really want to do this whole non-clinical evaluation. So I said, okay, fine, go for it. They went all the way through the process, and the FDA reviewer in one of their follow-up submission meetings said, this would have been a really good candidate for abbreviated 510K. That probably could have saved them anywhere from $300,000 to $1 million off the bat with their limited testing scope. So those type of things, when you want to maybe start off a little bit more aggressive and say, hey, maybe this is an abbreviated 510K, again, FDA will not tell you directly, yes, sounds good, submit that, but you'll see an example, like actual examples of FDA responses as we go through here to see what they say, which is a strong hint, sounds good, okay?
Yeah, I've even seen in a 510K submission that when FDA came back with questions, they actually encouraged the submitter to set up a pre-submission to review the questions. So there are times where FDA will be a little bit stronger in their language. When you submit the 510K, they may come back and say, hey, David, great work here, a few questions, why don't you submit the responses to the questions in the form of a pre-submission? So that happens too.
Yeah, again, relationship building, right? Other thing that's really critical, because we're all in this to make actually humanity better, but you can't make humanity better without raising money sometimes, right? It's kind of intertwined. So just as an example, again, one of my clients, they basically reached a funding plateau. Their burn rate was high. They were losing money on development. Amazing product, class 2 product, 510K product, but a lot of their investors were really wary about the regulatory strategy. They were concerned. They said, you know what, this might not be a class 2 device, and they wouldn't be convinced by, I wrote an opinion piece. We actually got it vetted by another attorney group. Weren't convinced. So I said, you know what, guys, let's just go to the FDA and talk to them. And did it, got the meeting minutes. Within 2 weeks, they raised a bridge round of $750,000. So it's a really good inflection point as a company to go to a pre-sub, get some preliminary feedback, show it to investors and say, hey, look, this isn't that risky as you guys thought. Really good business tool for companies. So why submit a pre-sub from a technical perspective? Your R&D folks are going to love it. It basically helps streamline their design inputs, helps them streamline what they need to target, right? A really good example of this is, give me an example of something that you guys work on. Give me a product. Somebody just shout one out. Catheter! Oh, somebody said catheter, I think, right? Anybody work on catheters? It's like really one of my favorite areas. It's super easy. Okay, catheters, right? So there's a lot of catheter standards, recognized consensus standards for catheters, right? There's a lot of catheter guidance. So imagine you sit down as an R&D engineer with a brand new catheter and you have like 700 documents that tell you what your catheter needs to do. You can start figuring out what your development path is for that specific catheter, picking and choosing all these standards, putting together a test plan and saying, hey, FDA, what do you think about this test plan? You get comments on that. Versus freaking out for 6 months, right? Going to submission and saying, oh, you forgot this specific standard for tensile tests or leak testing. Well, crap. Well, that's, we could have avoided that. Informal regulatory pathway guidance, right? Again, they're not going to tell you, they're not going to say, yes, do that submission pathway, but how you ask the question. This is like a poker game. It's a little bit of like a poker game / chess match when you go to these pre-subs. You have to, position your questions appropriately, okay, and we'll give you some tips on that. You have to basically not force the FDA to tell you what you want, but frame it in a way that they can respond, okay? It's a game of give and take with those type of questions, so that could help you determine your regulatory pathway or at least get some confidence in it. Another really good and probably the most used reason for 510Ks after regulatory strategy confirmation is to basically give feedback on planned non-clinical, clinical, and animal studies, right? Because that can be, as you know, the most expensive and time-consuming piece of your development cycle. So that's a really good opportunity to go to FDA and say, this is our planned studies, got any feedback, got any thoughts, and really de-risk that aspect of product design development. Johnny, you have anything to add to that?
Well, let's go back to that catheter example, and you've got you found all these standards and all these things, and as an engineer, your inclination is I need to do it all, or I'm going to pick and choose. And I think that's the key thing to think about is you can spend the time to assess and evaluate the applicability of all of these different parts and pieces and testing and so on. And you can present a case to the FDA, we're doing this one because, we're not doing this one because, and get them to weigh in. So, really important. Question?
Your comment about how you asked the question and the importance of wording brought me back to the initial statement regarding the notes that are taken, how important they are. So this may be an obvious question, but are they recorded so the notes are precise word for word, or is someone taking notes?
Yeah. So we'll also cover that, but I'll answer that quickly. I feel it's unfair because I didn't answer his question. Don't get offended. I'm sorry. But this is a quick one. So the short answer is you will have to have somebody on your team taking notes. It can be a dedicated scribe that you bring to the meeting. In the case of a face-to-face meeting or a teleconference, you can be taking the meetings. When I represent a company in a pre-sub, I never take notes myself unless they're really critical notes that I want to jot down because I want to be focused on addressing the agency throughout. So I'll have somebody actually from the team, dedicated note taker doing that. And we'll get into those logistics, I promise. But it usually cannot be recorded. You can ask, but the answer is going to be no, okay? The one thing that I'll mention, though, is that the meeting minutes do not have to be detailed. In fact, if you look at the guidance, it specifically says it doesn't need to be word by word. It needs to just summarize the key points, the key highlights, and the key answers. And the cool thing, again, just to answer briefly here, is it's not you do so the sponsor does the notes, you submit them to the FDA, and the FDA issues you back the final meeting minutes. So it is a game. It's a chess game. However, it's a very dangerous chess game because I have heard anecdotally that a company did try to sneak in FDA said that we're good here, and that the FDA did not like that very much. So there's a strategy behind a lot of this, which is why, again, not to toot my horn or other consultants, if you don't have somebody inside of your organization that can do that, it's a good opportunity to hire somebody to help you through that process because it is a chess match, if you will.
It totally is. I mean, and there is art to it, and David has done this many times. So even if you just said, hey, we've put together this pre-submission, we did it on our own, and had him put his eyes on it and give you some feedback, that's worth the cost of doing that because it is got to know how to dance with any regulatory agency, and this is one of those moments where knowing how to dance is really important. So, good question though, really good question.
Yeah. I have read people's notes in their own words, and I think, God, were they at the same place I was?
Yes, absolutely. That's why you don't get to do the final meeting minutes. That's why the FDA does. So yeah, and we'll go through those logistics. So whether I should do one, who thinks it's a good idea to do a pre-sub by now? Anybody? Yeah? No? People are not convinced, or are you just being hard? Okay, that's okay. We'll convince you. The next step is when to submit a pre-submission. Anybody have any ideas? Don't read this for a second. Think about what I just kind of went through. When do you think, give me a practical example within your organization that you might submit a pre-submission? Anybody? Yep, very good. That's actually a very, very good point. A lot of companies, they'll have their product on the market already. They'll do a design change. They're thinking they need to do a special 510K or some other iteration of a 510K. They might go to FDA to confirm that strategy or to review some information supporting that. Again, they're not going to blatantly tell you that works. Yeah, go for it, but it's a good opportunity. So good point. Yep. What else? Anybody familiar with 82030, design controls, waterfall model, all that fun stuff? Let's think about it from that perspective. When do you think might be a good time? Is there one answer, first of all? Early as possible is good, although not too early, and we'll get into why. But there's not one answer to that. It really depends, like the FDA says, on your planning needs. Let me explain to you what I mean. You can be a company who has done a lot of clinical development, really has a lot of data, but really isn't sure about your regulatory strategy. So you've done a lot of this design verification validation, but you really don't know about your regulatory strategy. Try to not be that type of company, but that can be you. Or you could be a company who has a really foundational, great regulatory strategy. It's been vetted, right? But they're right at the point of finalizing their design inputs, right? They're finalizing those technical requirements and are really not clear on which ones apply because of differences with their predicates, based on standards, all these different things. So the key takeaway here is you really want to do it earlier than later, right? Generally, you want to do it prior to your actual submission. So generally, you want to do it before your application, but it really depends on your organization. That's the key thing. And okay, David, that's really general. Thanks a lot. You didn't really help us there. We'll go through some iterations of that as well. John, did you want to touch on that at all?
Yeah, I think, you got to think about the moments in time in your design and development efforts when you're about to incur a big spend, from a capital standpoint, and how much certainty you have with your plans before you make that big spend. And those are good times to think about, is now a good time to do, don't walk that way, is now a good time to do a pre-submission? And the other thing to keep in mind too is you could do this multiple times during your design and development process if you so chose. There's no rule that says thou shalt only have one pre-sub per device. So just keep that in mind.
So, gentleman over there mentioned early, right? The earlier the better. So generally, that's a good approach to think of, right? So you want to get that information early so you don't, again, go committed to, bad regulatory pathways, bad development, bad data. But why might that be an issue if you're too early? And there is a too early. Anybody? Think about a situation where it might be too early. Forget regulatory, forget quality. Think of a relationship with somebody. What do you think might happen if you go too early to the FDA with information? Literally, that is something that I have observed, right? Anecdotally, I don't have data on this. But if you go too early, if you're basically just asking, you go through your whole pre-sub process, sometimes they will actually not even accept your pre-sub requests, okay? And we'll go through those logistics here shortly. But if they do, and you go to them with 4 or 5 questions, and the questions are, hey, we're Nuco, and we're doing this new product. What do you think? Or, we plan on manufacturing the product with a contract manufacturer. What do you think? Do those questions, if you were the FDA and you were getting those questions, could you answer those well? No, right? You don't have data in front of you. So one thing that cannot be decoupled from this pre-sub process is it's not just a request for information. That information has to be framed with your information and your data. And we'll show you some examples as we go. I promise, I keep saying that. I think it's like the 7th time I said that. This is all like the basic stuff. Now we're going to get into the meat and potatoes of some examples of my actual files. So,
FDA they're not in charge of your regulatory strategy. And so if you go to them too early, some companies want to do this. Like, I'm just going to throw it to the FDA and have them tell me the answers. And then once they tell me the answers, then I'll just figure it out from there. But the FDA's job is not to develop your regulatory strategy.
Yeah, and a funny example of that is even if you do a really good job on framing your question, sometimes you get a really terrible response. One client of mine that did not let me to show their information, I prepared a 3-page assessment of a drug product specification for them. 3 pages, that 3 pages was like just chock full of information, had a beautiful table, and we requested, does the FDA agree with the proposed product specification, blah, blah, blah. And the answer, I kid you not, was the FDA sees no issues with that at this point. So that's good, but it's also not like, additional data that I can use. So always expect those type of responses, a range of them, and we'll show some examples here. The general takeaway from when to do a pre-sub is prior to initiating major studies or evaluations, especially big non-clinical animal trials, and then also not too early. So there has to be a sweet spot. So if you think about it from the design development perspective, sometimes you'll hear people say, like other consultants say, try to do it before and right at your design freeze, right? And I don't really like that term too much, but I think it's colloquially something that you guys understand. So, design freeze would be a good time to determine whether you need a pre-sub.
Yeah, was there a question?
Well, I was just wondering, what happens if you start down the road and you have a major supplier who's critical and you lose it? Then you need to go back and do pre-sub or re-pre-sub?
So the question was, what happens if you get down the road and you lose a major supplier? Do you have to do a pre-sub? So again, there's no right answer to that. It's, do you think that supplier represented such a risk to your product, regulatory strategy, that's something that needs to be addressed? That probably wouldn't qualify for a pre-sub alone, right? Because that's something that's maybe considered a design change, a manufacturing change that you would have to assess internally. FDA has guidances on assessing those types of changes. But again, if it's a class 3 device and it's a pacemaker battery supplier and there's a lot of implications for that, that might be sufficient information to go to the agency for. Okay, so a couple of don'ts. We'll talk about do's, right? Don't use the pre-sub for an information gathering meeting, okay? They hate that, right? So if you go to the agency and say, hey, what's a 510K? What is a and again, you laugh, but this is actually, anecdotal evidence of this happening. What is a 510K? Do you think we have a 510K product? What product predicate should we use? That's not going to fly. And again, it goes back to your point, which is you look kind of silly doing that, right? Don't go to the FDA too early or too late. So if you go to the FDA, not a client of mine, but a consultant friend of mine went to the FDA after they basically did all their validation work. So their product was ready to commercialize, and they did a pre-sub. And sure, they did a pre-sub prior to their submission, so it still counts. But some of I told them almost like, well, you might not like the answers if it's something that you're going to have to go back and revise. Thank God they didn't have to do that, right? They kind of did it as almost like before we spend this money on this consultant to do this 510K, we want to just confirm that our validation results were done. But again, if you talk about validation being that final step prior to commercialization and design transfer, that's probably not the best time to start doing a pre-sub. Would you agree? So that's kind of the things to watch out for. Don't expect the agency to give you commitments to unsupported answers. I've seen actual pre-subs. In fact, as part of an angel network, I did some due diligence on this company, and they were struggling. They had just spent almost $200,000 doing some preliminary regulatory work, and they basically said, hey, David, look at this pre-sub request. They didn't get accepted. Their pre-sub request wasn't accepted. Why do you think that is? First of all, it was 6 pages, okay? There's 4 questions. None of the questions had any supporting information. So all the questions that we'll go through today, they have to have supporting data, and we'll talk about how to structure that when we get into the meat and potatoes. And then lastly, don't expect FDA to give you clearance now, right at the pre-sub. So that's not the intent of a pre-sub. To be honest, I always try to get them to commit, as much as possible during a pre-sub. Like, hey, what do you think the chances are? What do you think about our predicate? Again, the intent of the pre-sub is not to get your clearance at that point. They still have to do a 510K, right? Review, and often actually in their responses they'll actually say, although the FDA cannot confirm this until review, they believe that this is an acceptable approach, blah, blah, blah. So it's really a guessing game, and you'll see some of those responses here shortly. A couple of things about logistics. You get one shot generally, okay? The FDA does not like to see multiple pre-subs. It's very clear in their guidance. They might actually request for you to do a pre-sub, like John was saying, like, okay, this was great. Why don't you come back within a few months to do a pre-sub on this specific subset, okay? But generally, you get one shot at a pre-sub. Okay, that's the golden rule with consultants. I won't work with a client who wants to do multiple pre-subs because it's an abuse of the system. And then again, if you talk about perspective, if you talk about perception, the optics of doing multiple pre-subs, it's almost like cheating, right? So try to get all your pre-sub rationale in one pre-sub. And that's really the whole game with when you do it. English only, okay? The FDA is very clear on that. There's been a huge surge in OUS, outside of the US, applications. And that's something that, again, a lot of the pre-sub requests that I've been getting most recently have been from Japan, from companies in Japan trying to get into the US market. So but they need to be in English. You get assignment of something called a Q number, and that Q number is basically date-based. So because you don't have a 510K yet, the logistics of the pre-sub is actually kind of interesting still. You use some 510K forms for getting it through the process, but you don't get like a 510K tracking identification like you would in a normal submission. So that's kind of the logistics of this. You do have to use the e-copy program. So basically you submit hard copy, okay, and there's some guidance on that, and then you submit soft copy, which is either CD, ROM, or most people are using now jump drives. And the last piece of this is that pre-subs for CDRH, for Center of Devices Radiological Health, the device people, goes to the FDA's Document Control Center. So in the IND side, in the drug world, I have to figure out who this thing is going to go to, which division, and submit it to them. And the CDRH side goes directly to the Document Control Center. Any info on that, John?
Pretty straightforward.
So e-copy is actually really critical. So on the refuse to accept checklist, as well as other anecdotal checklists, they'll make sure that your format is appropriate before they even accept your request, okay? So how to do that is by following this e-copy program for medical device submissions. Now, this applies to 510Ks, PMAs, other sub-programs, but a lot of that also applies to the pre-submission itself. He's not here, but I'm going to give a plug to somebody, not because they paid me, but because this type of service is just like the best. So FDAecopy.com, it's not affiliated with the FDA, but it's Rob Packard. A lot of you probably know him. He has this program that basically takes care of that for you. And as a consultant, I'll give you a quick example. This year, January 19th, 2017, I still remember it was yesterday, it was the 30-day deadline to send in one of our pre-sub meeting packets, and I was up till right about midnight trying to do a freaking table of contents and trying to print out, do the e-copy stuff. It's a pain, okay? I still do it, right? But things like this, FDA e-copy, it's a good option if you want to just kind of, hey, here it goes, throw it over the wall, get it ready for me, and submit it for me.
And David, I have a similar kind of story. I was working with a startup a few years ago, and we had a goal to get the 510K submitted before the end of the year. And did you know that FedEx Kinko's is open on New Year's Eve? And I spent, let's just say, an entire day there getting that all squared away. It is really one of the biggest pains, but I can assure you that if you have a file name wrong or a page number wrong or it seems like a really silly thing, that is a reason to reject your submission and for you to go fix it. So do pay attention to this. Do take advantage of FDAecopy.com because Rob's done, I don't know the exact count, but let's just say probably hundreds of these things, and he's tried to make it as simple as possible. So a really good service. You can waste a lot of time dealing with the e-copy, I promise you.
Yeah, it's fun, not fun stuff. But anyway, so timing. So we talked about what's a pre-sub, when should we do one? Now, what is this thing? Now we're going to talk about timing, which is the question that gentleman had. So in general, okay, and when I look at PDUFA deadlines, I laugh a little because we haven't met them since 2012. But anyway, in general, the time frame from meeting requests to meeting happening is anywhere from 75 to 90 days. In special cases where it's a high risk or a high risk population or it's a special needs device, they might accelerate that, but you're pretty much sitting in that 3-month range. I haven't seen a lot of pre-subs that have kind of really backed up earlier than that from start to finish, especially for things like general hospital products, catheters, those type of products that are kind of more high volume. If you get lucky and submit to, like the anesthesiology, or actually it's in the same general hospital product code, but in product codes that are, have less products, right, a product backlog, you might get in quicker. But that's a fairly reasonable time frame for the pre-submission. And what we're going to do now, so I kind of gave you the crash course on the pre-submission. So let's walk through an actual, pre-submission, multiple examples, but let's walk through that timeline and really put some practicality behind it. So here is the most important part of the entire pre-sub process. It's actually the part that has nothing to do with FDA. This is where your pre-sub is great or it fails. And I really do mean this. I can't tell you the number of times that I have sat down with a client who's like, ready to do a 510K next week, ready to go. All right, can I take a look at your product? Yeah, here's the Urine Collection Cup Pro 2000. what is this? It's SLA. Oh, so this is a prototype. No, we're ready for a 510K. This is our product. I'm like, wait a second. You realize that after you get clearance, you have to sell, like you're a commercial manufacturer of a medical device, right? And they're like, oh no, you mean it's not like a patent where I don't really have to, I just had to theorize? No, that's not how this works. That is the biggest problem that I face as a consultant. I sit down with these companies, they are not ready for a 510K. Extrapolate that backwards, I sit down with these clients, they are not ready for a pre-sub, okay? So and I'll give you this in practical terms because a lot of you might use consultants in the future. You sit down with a consultant and say, we're ready for a pre-sub. We heard David talk at this thing, John says that we should do this, let's do it. I sit down with them, I'm going to ask them, okay, let me take a look at your design history file or what you have for documentation, test results, you have your sterilization section, biocompatibility section. Let me take a look at, have you looked at any predicates? Have you done any regulatory analysis? Usually it's this. Wait, I thought we were going to go ask FDA about all that. No, that you have to be at least ready enough with enough information, your product to a good enough point, and I can't define that for you, right? But a good enough point to go to the FDA for. So when it comes to timing, figuring out when to do this and understanding the content that goes into your pre-submission will help you figure out if you're ready or not. And at the end of this timing section, you'll be experts in what actually has to go, what the FDA is expecting and what you need to have ready. Because my job is to collect all of that information, Dropbox, Google Drive, iCloud Drive. I will never be, I have so many drive access points at this time that I really don't know where's what anymore. But that's what they do. They say, hey, here's all the stuff. Now it's my job to take it, piece it together, and present it in a pre-sub format. Does that make sense?
I mean, you're telling a story, right? You're telling a story, and this is like the introduction of your story. It's like, the summer blockbuster movie comes out, and you watch the trailer, and you're like, based on that trailer, is this a movie I want to see or not? Well, think of your pre-submission in a similar context. You're telling a story. Is this going to be an exciting movie? And do you have enough of the hooks in that trailer to make it interesting? And do you know enough about that? Or are you still just, you still got this SLA? I mean, think about it, fast forward to after your 510K submission goes to the agency and you get clearance. I mean, what does that mean? Market clearance. When FDA sends you that letter, it says market clearance. Guess what happens now at that point? You're now on the radar screen. I mean, FDA says every Class 2, Class 3 device is going to get inspected every 2 years. Now, sometimes that happens, sometimes maybe not so much. But are you ready to roll the dice and have an FDA inspection for this device you just got cleared on a 510K? Theoretically, they could come any day.
The story part is, that's actually the key takeaway. The story part, telling a story is really critical. So the bottom line is before you even start a pre-sub, if I sit down with a perfect client who has everything ready, they're like, all right, David, we're ready to start. It'll still take me about a week or two to go through all the material, put together the package, right? Come up with the questions. That's still 10 to 15 days, which doesn't get built into that overall 75, 90 days. Ed. So Ed asked, well, how much do you have to add on to that? How does that work over the overall strategy? So the first place to start with that is you have to tack on at least a couple weeks for yourself or for a consultant to prepare the materials for a pre-sub. So that now brings it from 90 days all the way through potentially, 2 months or a week, couple weeks later to 100 and something days, right? So always build that in. Now, what I can tell you is 0 out of whatever times do I get a perfect client. Usually they're missing a lot of information. I have to work with them on certain things. So that 10 to 15 days is actually usually more often like 3 months. I hate to say it, but that's practically speaking what happens. The most recent example, I met with a client last year in December. We are just finishing their pre-sub packet in 2 weeks, okay? And we're already in May. So that happens often. So the key thing is don't pay somebody until you're ready to pay somebody, or don't go to do a pre-sub until you're ready to do a pre-sub, okay? And we'll go through what stuff needs to go in there so you know you're ready.
I'm really confused because before you said don't do everything, don't have all your content data and testing, because that's ready for your 510K then.
No. So there's a difference between a 510K readiness and pre-sub readiness. Pre-sub has specific things that you need to have ready, but even something so simple like a device description, right? That's one of the things that needs to be in your pre-sub, as well as your 510K, but not as intense in your pre-sub. That's something that you'd be surprised where you ask somebody, a client, what is your product? We have a catheter. Well, what's the intended use of your catheter? We don't know. What's the indications, the secondary indications for your catheter? We don't know. Okay, well, what's your biocompatibility strategy? Don't do your biocompatibility test, that's fine. But what's your strategy? We don't know. Sterilization validation, how is this thing going to be sterilized? We don't know. Again, you don't have to have the sterilization validation data. You don't have to have the biocompatibility data at the point of a pre-sub, but you at least have to start figuring out what you're going to ask FDA, right? Because again, if you go back to the thing I said earlier, if you go too early, it's useless because they're not going to have enough data to help you point you in the right direction. Does that make sense?
So you don't have to have all the testing.
No, unless you require test data to support a question. So here's an example. This was an actual literal example, and I think I might have this up here. We were really concerned about some of the usability of a device of ours. I'm not going to they didn't let me disclose. So there's a device, there's a usability aspect where the user has to press something to actuate a needle. That needle was getting actuated in the wrong direction, which could hurt the patient, right? Or the user. So in that case, we had done some preliminary usability studies and said, okay, here are some of the high risks that we identified in that usability study. We're going to focus moving forward on some of our next usability studies on just these, and we used that data to support that strategy. So again, you're not talking about summative study validations with multiple patients, different user groups, but you have some data to support your rationale. Does that make sense? So you basically just need enough data to support your questions. That's what it boils down to.
I mean, go back to the now famous urine collection SLA prototype that David spoke about. You could be at that SLA stage. You may be able to do some rough preliminary bench testing or performance testing on that concept to corroborate your indications for use and some design features and so on. That testing may be perfectly valid to include in a pre-submission. So there's levels to this for sure.
And you know what? I apologize because this is confusing. So the third bullet point really should say, assumes all content data testing is completed and ready to support your questions. Okay, it's not for the 510K. So you're right. That is confusing. Go ahead.
What about the special requirements for IVDs?
That is a whole conversation itself, but there's complexing IVDs and other types of IVDs require certain device description requirements, certain indications, expansions that are very critical for IVDs itself. If you want, maybe during one of our breaks, let's chat about those specifics. Cool. Okay, so we're doing preparation. We get hire somebody or do it internally. One thing that holds up a lot of people, this is an actual email from FDA, it's those little surprising things that you forget about. Secure email. Anybody have a secure email with the FDA here? Okay, this is something that you have to have before you start submitting things to the agency through email, right? So when this becomes critical is when you submit your pre-submission request, your regulatory project manager, somebody will contact you, typically phone call or email, but often they're really starting to work through email. And you can't really send any PDFs or anything to anybody unless you have what's called secure email. So just a little tip here, make sure that somebody within your organization or your consultant has their own secure email address. There's no requirement for example, when I work with, let's say Greenlight.guru becomes an original, medical device manufacturer, there's no requirement that if I'm representing them as a consultant, I have to have a David at Greenlight.guru, right? But it's always a nice, again, optics. Optics is very important. It's nice to know that I have that email, they see that email, even though I'm saying that I'm a regulatory consultant because I have to disclose that. It's those little tiny things that just make the process easier. So always have a secure email with FDA. The process may take quite a bit of time, unfortunately. These are specific. Actually, they send you back. They actually hire, FDA doesn't have internal IT people do this. They hire another group, I think it's an IBM group to do this. But again, key takeaway, secure your email with FDA, okay? For pre-IND submissions, again, so that was device part. For drug submissions, drug device combination products, again, auto-injectors, inhalers, those type of products. There's a little bit of a difference with devices. When you submit your request for pre-submission, you submit the request with all that information, that package, calling the briefing package or the meeting package, along with your questions at once. In the drug space, it's a little bit different. You can submit your request with your questions and then promise FDA you're going to send them your backup information 30 days prior to the meeting. Okay? That's the only little key difference there. So, although you don't have to be ready for a 510K, right, before doing a pre-sub, because otherwise what would be the point? The more you can make your pre-sub look like a 510K, think about it like a 510K light, the better. Why do you think that is? Anybody? Why do you think you want to make your pre-sub look as much like a 510K as possible? Again, not the extensive data, extensive information, but formatting, structure, information.
You're trying to condition the FDA. You want them to think of the answer that you want them to come up with. This is one of those subtle, this is the droid they're looking for, right? So you want to get them thinking, oh, wow, this really looks like a 510K. It's subtle, but that's really the intent behind it.
Yeah.
Art, there's art to it.
They're used to seeing it, right? They're used to seeing that information. If you all of a sudden deviate and don't do a device description, which actually is an explicit requirement, but let's say you called it product overview, and then you start putting in stuff there that doesn't belong there per the guidance, they're going to be like, what is this? I don't know what this is. They're humans, right? They want to see standardization. So we'll go over some tips and tricks on how to make this happen. The first one is to just follow the pre-sub content that's required. Okay? So we talked a lot about what a pre-sub is. So now we're really going to get into what actually goes into one. So this is what goes into one. Okay? A lot of boilerplate stuff in the beginning. So cover sheet, cover letter. You'd be surprised at how important that cover letter is, though. And we'll go through an example there as well. Device description, table of contents, indications for use / intended use, previous discussions or submissions, overview of product development, specific questions, which is the key point of this whole thing, right? That's really the most important part of this entire content packet. And then method of feedback and preferred dates if you're doing, in-person or teleconference. So this is what the pre-sub actually looks like, okay? So cover sheet, first part, cover sheet and letter. So the cover sheet and letter, there is no formal format for it, right? There's some guidance on what should be included there. But has anybody ever submitted a 510K or seen a 510K? So at the very beginning, there's this form, 3514, right? That basically it's like a 510K identification form. It's a CDRH cover sheet for submissions, not just for 510Ks.
Oh.
And that's great.
And this is what it looks like. Oh, there we go.
And that's what it looks like. It's blank. No, so for CDER, for CEDAR, when you're doing a drug application for a drug device combination product, there's form 1571, which is kind of the same thing. It's for INDs. So this cover sheet, right, it's not a mandate. So if you go home now and you do a pre-sub, you don't have to use form 3514. But again, going back to what John was saying, triggering things that reviewers are familiar with, you could use that as your cover page to signal this is not a submission, but this is a pre-submission. And there's actually a category right here, if you look at that top part, that talks about what kind of meeting are you doing, okay? Pre-510K meeting. So there's a category there for pre-510K meeting. A lot of the rest of the information in this form is only intended for your actual marketing application, for your 510K. But basically, it's up to the consultant or you to fill in as much stuff as you can. Really, that's as simple as it is. Fill in as much information as you know at that point. You don't have to submit everything. Because all they're going to do with this is just say, okay, I'm used to seeing the CDRH cover letter, so I'm going to take a look at this, and I know now that you're doing a pre-submission. Make sense?
I mean, it's a 5-page form, and you might complete 3 sections of the form. So don't think that you need to have responses to every bit of it. And we'll go through some of examples when we go through the case study here in a few moments.
Yeah. Yep. So what do you need to know when you're doing a pre-submission? So this is kind of similar to, now we're going to kind of put off our pre-sub hat and just put on our 510K hat. The first thing you need to know is, who does this need to go to? Does anybody remember where pre-submissions for devices go? Anybody remember what FDA group or agency or division? DCC? Document Control Center? Yep, somebody said it. Sorry, somebody said it back there. No, they didn't. Okay, so Document Control Center. But the next step is not just where it goes, that's just the address. Who it goes to, right? Who is this? Who's going to receive my pre-submission? Who do you think receives your pre-submission?
Don't leave it to the FDA to try to figure out and guess. Well, I don't know what this is. We're just I'll send it to David. He might be the right guy. They're not going to do the guesswork. Point them in the right direction.
How do you point them in the right direction, John? By doing this. What you want to do is if you have, first of all, you kind of need at least a general idea of your regulatory strategy. You might be submitting, a pre-sub to kind of get some credibility or assumption or confirmation of assumption on your regulatory strategy. But if you need to have at least an idea of what kind of product code you have. Remember, the FDA is not going to tell you, yep, that's the right product code, or you're good to go on the 510K, but they might give you some information. So you at least have to have a rough idea. You have to have some sort of regulatory assessment to say, all right, we're doing a 510K, we are doing, this is our product code, and this is our, regulation number. Once you have that information, you actually can pull up basically that type of device. So this is a device, an intravascular administration set, which has multiple product codes, this one has FPA, is their product code, 3-letter designation. So when I pull the product code, FPA, so my device is going to be a 510K, it's going to be an intravascular administration set, and it's going to go to Office of Device Evaluation, where the majority of CDRH reviews go, and it's going to go to the General Hospital's Devices Branch, GHGB. Okay, I got that information. Now, I'm going to go to the FDA website, and I'm going to say, who runs that group? And I'm going to pull up the division, so Division of Anesthesiology, General Hospital, etc. I'm going to go to General Hospital Devices Branch, GHGB, which you just showed ties back to who reviews our stuff. And I'm going to see that the representative there is Alan Stevens. So it'll either be a division or branch chief or somebody that's designated, a senior project manager, okay? So that's who my pre-sub will be addressed to. Make sense? Sounds silly, but it's actually really important. In fact, it's so important that what I do, even before I do a pre-sub, I give these people a call, and I say, hi, can I speak to Dr. Stevens? They're usually not there, so I have to wait, but then usually I'll get a response. They're actually pretty responsive. Hi, Mr. Stevens, my name is David Moore. I represent a company called this. I just wanted to give you a heads up and confirm that I will be submitting a pre-sub next week or in a couple of weeks. Just wanted to confirm that you're the appropriate person to receive this. Should I CC anybody else? And often, actually, I'll hear, you know what, David, we're really busy this week. Can you send this to my senior regulatory project manager instead? And that's fine. So that's the type of stuff that, again, you start forming the relationship. You want to make FDA happy. Make sense? Go ahead. Well, vacant, so you're not really going to submit to the deputy director or clinical deputy director. That's not really who's going to receive these. And I've never seen a vacant under there might be, so you might have to call. Yeah, that's a good question. Actually, you stumped me. You did stump me. I don't.
You can probably call the ombudsman or some other office
small
within
business,
the agencies. Yeah, there's a few different general numbers. And David's right. You may not get a live person the moment that you call, but you can leave a voicemail. And, just note to self, anytime a phone number comes across on your phone with a 301 area code, probably one that's worth answering, because good chance it's somebody from the FDA, which might be good news, might not be news you want to hear, but either way, it's an important phone call. It might be helping answer the question that you're after. But do leave a message. They're pretty responsive. And we all know the FDA website isn't very fun to navigate, but with a little bit of patience, you can get pointed in the right direction, and you can find this information pretty easily.
Yeah, and write a script before. I mean, honestly, I try to be very, professional when we, hello, Mr. Stevens, my name is David Moore, I represent this company. Be very professional, be very concise in what you want, and then request a callback. I get callbacks within, 48 hours often, so it's really actually a pretty good system. So you figured out who you're sending this to. You got to do your letter. here's what your pre-submission cover letter looks like. And I know you can definitely see all those details, right, guys? I'm sorry about I thought it was going to be a closer presentation, so I'll kind of walk you through it. First of all, the address to DCC. So it's basically, you just put the Silver Springs buildings, there's a bunch of buildings, a bunch of different building numbers, but this is the Dock Control Center. Address your pre-sub, dear Mr. Stevens, brief company introduction. So as the authorized representative for blank, a company based in Carlsbad, California, I'm hereby submitting a pre-submission request for an anticipated 510K. Let them know what you're doing, who you are. If you're using a consultant, make sure that the consultant identifies themselves as a consultant, okay, as the authorized representative. And then you request what type of meeting you'd like. So there's 3 types of meetings which we'll go over. So I'm going to table that till now, but you request the type of meeting you want. Give them a little bit of information on what the product is. Hey, we're working on a new intravascular administration set. I always like to throw in, hey, we've prepared this in accordance with the guidance so that they know we're not idiots and that we know what we're doing, right? Just a kind of a boilerplate confidentiality statement to avoid this becoming public information, which it won't, but again. And then also just a determination of the format of how this was submitted. So, hey, we sent you an e-copy and we also sent you a hard copy. So this is what a pre-sub letter actually looks like. It's very simple, 1 page. I put my contact information down here, and then that's really comes right after that Form 3514. So that Form 3514, what is this? What are we doing? We're aware of this form. Cover letter, okay, you're doing a pre-sub. This is the type of request you're looking at. Next comes the content. Any questions on the actual letter itself? Okay. So then comes the actual content. So now you're building the pre-sub. The first part is the device description. This device description is not just, we're building this product. Is it, John?
No, this is, I mean, you want to, again, it's about telling your story. This is where you really start to tell a story. Everything that David has shared with you for now has been somewhat of, guiding information, but it's been more about, formatting and logistics. This is where you really start to get into the meat of the issue. You're starting to paint a picture of what it is that you're doing and why it's important. This section is very important component of that pre-submission. So you got to tell a pretty good story.
And that story, if you look at, again, what did I say in the beginning? The more you can match this up with your 510K, the better, right? So do you think at the point of a pre-sub you're going to have this done? A substantial equivalent summary, like a full comprehensive, our product is substantial equivalent to the other? Probably not, right? You're not quite there yet. Maybe you've done some investigation, have identified a predicate, have done some predicate analysis, which is always a good practice to put in your pre-sub. But some of the 510K information that belongs in the device description probably won't be available yet. So in green, I've highlighted the things that you kind of need to have. So technical description and overview. Technical description and overview is literally, what is your product? Give me the main systems, give me the main subsystems. What's the mechanism of action, right? Those are the key technical information pieces that I want to see in a pre-sub. You have to tell FDA off the bat, what is my product? System architecture. This isn't an explicit requirement, but I make all of my clients do this because for me, if I see even something so simple as a cup, right? And let's say there's a bag here. I want to know, I consider as a manufacturer, the cup is the system. There's a subsystem here of bottom. There's an let's just pretend here with me. There's an electronic subsystem. I want them to be aware of all the components of my products. Well, David, that's kind of stupid. Why is that such a critical thing? The key, one thing that happens often is, and this, I get it, engineers, my background is in engineering. I did my undergrad and master's in engineering, and I get how that mentality works, but sometimes I'll get this, and I'd love to have your opinion on this, John, but you'll sit down with somebody, who's doing a 510K, and they'll be working on this. Literally happened, a couple years ago. Somebody was putting together a new catheter. Okay, it was for a biopsy catheter, essentially, for BPA for prostate, and they wanted to connect it to like a capital piece of equipment, which basically showed the results, right? So went through this whole 510K process, did a pre-sub, got all this information collected, and at the end of, right before we're going to do our actual submission, the engineers had like a secret, they had a secret session. They said, hey, everybody, we want to invite you over to Carlsbad. We want to show you guys something else that's interesting here. I show up, and they changed that capital, display screen to an iPad, okay? And they're like, yeah, now we got an iPad, it's sexier, it's, more user-friendly. Why was I so upset? Why do you think I was so upset? It's a pretty significant design change, right? The whole UX has changed. Mobile medical applications have their own considerations. So when I define a system architecture, it's so that the FDA knows, that they don't get something later on in the pre-sub that says we have a device and then we have like this display that we built. And then at the submission they said, oh, we have this iPad. But you said that the display doesn't have to be this big. No, we said that for the display, not the iPad. So building out what your system looks like is really critical so that they have a visual representation of that. That's also helped by pictures, photos, and actually playing with the device.
No, it's a really good point. I mean, chances of your device being a singular component in isolation that doesn't interact with any other products or other products or devices is a little naive these days. So understanding how your product fits in a little bit of a bigger picture, and you have all these different components and these parts and pieces, it's key to help. Again, you're telling your story. Yeah. So tell your story as accurately as you possibly can.
Yep. So device description, a couple other things. Yeah, go ahead.
Just quickly about materials, go back there. How specific does it need to be, the pre-submission need? Is it like polycarbonate, or does it need to be like this polycarbonate from this supplier?
I'm going to turn that question back on you. What do you think I would say right now? Take a guess.
For a pre-submission, polycarbonate would be enough, but for the 510K, you need to be specific.
I'm gonna defer to one question. It's going to be, what are your questions for your pre-sub? So if most of your questions for your pre-subs are relating to material concerns, right, then you might want to have a more detailed BOM at that point, right? If none of your questions are really surrounding, materials or materials questions or testing questions, you might not need to have a fully fleshed out BOM, right? So again, it really depends. That you saw that FDA statement that I put in the beginning. The pre-sub content depends on where you're at and what the intent of your pre-sub is. So always defer back to your questions. That's a really good key. When you're thinking about how detailed does this have to be, does that have to be, always defer back to the actual questions being prepared in the pre-sub. Does that make sense? Yeah. So,
I mean, I'll just add to that. I mean, if that polycarbonate material is going to be patient contacting in some way, shape, or form, and one of your questions may be about what do I need to do from a biocompatibility testing standpoint? Like sometimes you may want to leverage history of use or a whole body of knowledge in the topic of biocompatibility. Being specific about that exact polycarbonate material might be more important than if you're asking more general questions. Does that make sense? Yeah.
And here's a little bit more of practical advice too. So this is something that's not, again, it's not explicitly mandated by any guidance or statutory requirement, but that I always include in a pre-sub, and I'll explain to you why for each of these. I always want to have my client do at least a preliminary hazard analysis, even if it's one page, identifying the key adverse events, key harms. I want to show, again, this is a game, right? You want to show FDA, hey, we know we're making a medical device. The medical device has to be safe and effective. What's the definition of safe? Freedom from unacceptable risk. How do we as manufacturers determine that? We do risk management, we do hazard analysis, we do FMEAs, those type of things. So having even like a preliminary hazard analysis that you can reference as you go through your pre-sub is really critical. The other thing that to me, I've had really good anecdotal feedback after submissions. I've actually gotten a letter from an FDA reviewer saying, I wish this was a best practice or that people would know about this, are these two things here, manufacturing flowchart and use flowchart. Imagine that you are an FDA reviewer. You have a brand new product you're reviewing, right? You don't know how this thing is used. So they're asking you all these questions about, what do you think about this testing strategy? What do you think about this usability? But they don't really understand how this product is going to be used in a clinical context. Putting together a use flowchart, it could be simple as step 1, unpackage. Step 2, take out catheter. Step 3, insert catheter. I mean, something even so simple will kind of frame this for them and say, and even if it doesn't tie directly to any of your questions, it helps them understand the questions in context a little bit better. Same thing for manufacturing. God, I can't remember, John, you probably face this too. How many actual companies or startups you work with are trying to do like their own GMP manufacturing facilities? 10%, if
Yeah,
that?
as I say, very, very, very few. You know,
Yeah.
it's like a lot of companies like, we're going to come up with fantastic design, and we're going to go through all the legwork, and then we're going to throw it over the wall to a contract manufacturer, and they'll figure it out. You know,
Yeah,
that's usually what
and
happens.
that's one of the biggest, and that's why I always want to have like a manufacturing flow chart. Again, to the extent, please understand, to the extent that it is known, right? You're not going to have all the details. You don't have to name names, but having at least a rough manufacturing flow chart. Hey, we're going to do molding here, and then we're going to do final assembly at a different facility, and we're going to do sterilization at another facility, and it's going to go back to the the final finished good manufacturer. That's sufficient. But just letting them know what that is, because again, you'd be surprised at how many of these little things become huge issues when you go to submission time. So these are some key tips that you might want to have for the device description section.
I mean, keep in mind that this pre-submission is for a 510K. A 510K is for market clearance. So you got to keep telling that story and sharing with the FDA your plan to design, develop, and manufacture the product. Because once you get that 510K clearance letter, that says thou shalt be able to sell this device in the United States, right? So showing that you have thought about how it's going to be manufactured and the flow is very important.
That's a good question. So I'll answer a different question and see if this addresses it. The Q sub should be, and very well should be, part of your actual submission. You should reference that within the previous discussions and submissions, because you want to basically have that as evidence that some of the decisions you made were based on feedback from the agency. Now, in terms of an FDA inspection, like when somebody's going to go to your facility and do a GMP, a quality systems inspection, I don't see why they would need to have a pre-sub, but I can see, for example, if you are the management representative for an inspection and they question you on, well, where did I don't agree, again, they're never going to say this, but I don't agree with your selection of this contract manufacturer, and you can potentially pull out the pre-sub, but I don't know why they would. Does that answer your question a little bit?
I mean, and another way to think about it is just like the feedback that you get from the FDA and a pre-submission isn't binding per se, it's also true in your case. I mean, things happen, things evolve. So FDA isn't going to hold you to the information that's in that pre-submission per se when it comes time to do an FDA inspection. An FDA inspection is going to be based on your adherence to 21 CFR Part 820. So you're going to need to be demonstrating that you've got a quality system in place and that you've got documents and records to show that you're in compliance with GMPs and things of that nature. Of course, as David mentioned earlier, 82030 design and controls is part of that. Of course, you're going to have all of your regulatory packets, your pre-submission, your 510K, any other regulatory packets, those are likely to be included as part of that submission, but they're kind of different groups, to be quite honest. I mean, the people who are reviewing pre-subs and 510Ks is a completely different group than what's going to be doing your FDA inspection.
Yeah.
It's a good question.
Yeah, good question, and go ahead.
Either any special requirements for products made out of the US, like China?
Yeah, so that in itself is a whole separate conversation as well. I'd love to maybe chat with you after to go through that. The short answer is yes. However, for the most part, the basis for application is the same for any product. So that's more on the registering, listing, quality system side that you have to have more concerns as a foreign manufacturer. So, go ahead.
Yeah, is pre-subs mostly used or not?
That's a great question.
Yeah, John, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I mean, excuse me, what is your name? Sorry, say again? Elvia asked earlier about if you have a 510K device that's cleared and now you're making a change to that, is a pre-submission a good idea? Potentially, yes. Same sort of thing that you described, maybe you're using it for one type of clinical use or one part anatomy of the body, and now you want to expand your indications for use. That's potentially a wonderful vehicle for a pre-submission, because you go through that 510K deciding when to make a change. FDA has a guidance document. I think the current published guidance document was released in 1997. They came out with later part of last year, 2 new draft guidance documents on deciding when to make changes for a 510K cleared device. One was software oriented. But you go through those decision trees, and there is a point where you say you're changing your indication for use. The box says new 510K if you follow that. So, if it's depending on what it is and how much of a change it is, it might be a good vehicle for a pre-submission. It's a good question.
Yep. And then the last thing I'll mention here is, again, this is not, you're not going to find this anywhere. But one thing that I like to do in my pre-subs is, if I am outsourcing manufacturing, which again, 90% of companies I work with are hiring, they're virtual companies, they're hiring CMOs. I like to tell FDA, hey, we are going to have a supplier qualification process in place to validate that these suppliers are good suppliers, okay? So just a little tip to make sure that you're signaling, because a lot of this relationship building is what you're telling FDA and what you're signaling. It is a good practice to put your proposed predicates in a brief summary. Again, you don't have to have the full substantial equivalence summary, but let them know. The more information you know, the better, right? The more information they know. So maybe put what your proposed predicates are for your 510K. Summarize any bench testing or studies that you might have performed. And then one of the things that I do like to do, if I anticipate that something's going to be a fight, for example, just last year actually, there was a product on the market. Our product has a requirement for injection force that was very different from another product, but then there's a third product that was very similar. So what we wanted to do was make sure that the FDA knew that that's where we're taking our data from. So I actually pulled a Freedom of Information Act, a FOIA request on that other new drug application, that device part, and referenced it within my pre-sub. I said, hey, we're using the spec because we found this information that you guys have already approved somewhere else. So again, in the spirit of the game, if you're taking a specific strategy, make sure you can back up that strategy with objective evidence. It's very strong when you tell the FDA, you've approved this in the past, you probably should approve it for me. Again, they could say no for multiple reasons, but it's a good tactic to make sure that you reference that information.
I mean, it's a good tactic when you think about technology, because sometimes there's a technology that you want to use that's useful or already cleared in some application that's very different than the application that you're interested in, and you're trying to make that leap to get that technology that's already been cleared by the agency, but also be used for this particular application. So those are areas where telling that story, again, it's your story, it's your device, to be able to paint that picture of why you're making that leap will help the agency a great deal.
Yeah, and device description, that's pretty much what is involved in there. Make sense? It's just basically describing the device. It's that straightforward. And kind of summarizing any information to support the description of that device. The next section is the intended use and indications. Is intended use and indications the same thing? Who says yes? Who says no? Good, yeah, this is usually a question that stumps people. So they're distinct differences, okay? And we'll talk a little bit about what that is. But the key in a 510K is what, right? Demonstrating substantial equivalence to a predicate. Substantial equivalence is defined as what? Same intended use, same technological characteristics, or different technological characteristics, but no new safety and efficacy concerns, right? So what do you think it needs to go into this intended use section? A, your intended use, and then any secondary or additional indications specific to your product. And we'll go through an example of what that means. So the intended use section should include the general intended use that you're claiming equivalence to, as well as any specifics to your product. So often, a product will be substantially equivalent to a general intended use statement. So for example, for intravascular administration sets, they're intended to deliver drugs, right, intravenously. That's kind of the general intended use. But there can be specific indications for anesthesia patients only, for different anatomical areas where it's placed, and that still meets essentially the definition of intended use. So much so that I don't want you to believe me, I want you to believe the agency when they say that, where you can say basically, as discussed in the intended use section, differences in the indications for use is okay, right? And they go on to explain what kind of indications changes there are. This is really critical. So not only for pre-subs, but for 510Ks, you can meet an intended use, but you can have different indications specific to different patient populations, what's it called, a disease, right? Subset of a disease. That happens often with startups who are trying to corner one specific niche of a market before they expand into a different market. okay? So this all goes into that intended use indications for use section. Here's an example of what I just said. So I was working on the 880-5440 is a regulation that governs IV administration sets. It's really ubiquitous, tons of these products out there. Now, 880-5440 identifies a bunch of different product codes, and those product codes are 3-letter designations for different types of products. So you can see under IV administration sets, there's check valves, filters, actual administration sets, stopcocks, tubing, all that stuff that comprises these tools that basically administer drugs into you, right? So the general product description of this product is an IV system used to administer fluids from container to blah, 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 which may comprise XYZ. So as long as my product generally fits in that intended use bucket, my 510K basis is still met. However, I might have, as part of my specific indications, a little bit of a different twist. So these are actually 2 product code FPA products that were approved, and you'll notice their intended use statement is slightly different, but they still were able to claim that substantial equivalence. So when it comes to a pre-sub, laying this out for the FDA is really important so that they understand, hey, look, we know that you're going to have the same intended use. We're more comfortable with your 510K. Does that make sense? Go ahead.
Supposing you have a product that can be used for medical reasons, but can also be used for other things that are totally not medical, would you still need a 510?
Yeah, so intended use is really dependent. So starting backwards, even before you get into intended use, what is a medical device, right? Medical device is defined in section 201H of the FD&C, right? So that's that whole, remember the whole statement about an instrument, apparatus, blah, 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 that can detect, diagnose, all that beautiful statement, that is medical in nature, right? So a medical device has to meet that definition to be a medical device. So often, actually, products that have veterinary use will actually have to go through a specific, just as if they didn't have anything before in the past, they'll have to go through a traditional 510K process. Now, because it's a veterinary device, you might be able to use some of the animal study data to demonstrate that it might be analogous to human use, but it's the same basis of approval is always based on that clinical application. Does that make sense?
But your product that you're describing, there may be a number of indications for use that now make it not medical.
Used for something that has
Right.
just is so flexible that it can be used totally outside of the medical.
Sure.
Plus, it also is useful in the medical.
Sure, yeah. FDA, those non-medical device indications, FDA, they don't have jurisdiction. I don't want to say they don't care, but they don't care per se. The tricky part is the company that wants to bring that product to market for these non-medical applications and be able to market these medical applications. It's a slippery slope, so just make sure it's very clear. But make sure your medical intended use and indications for use are clearly defined and articulated and follow the FDA regulations. You know, as David cited a couple slides ago, there are specific regulations and product codes that apply to thousands and thousands and thousands of indications. So just be very careful on those situations. I know that was kind of a vague answer. Does that give you enough?
A lot of this, unfortunately, is vague because it really depends on your product, right? So the key takeaway in the intended use section is put your intended use that you plan on demonstrating substantial equivalence to with your predicates, and then any secondary indications you might have. That's really what belongs in the pre-sub. So you can inform FDA that, hey, this is what we're targeting. And going back to, is that necessary in a pre-sub? Those are one of those things that I would say, yeah, at the point of doing a pre-sub, you're doing it because it's a pre-sub to a 510K. So if you know you're doing a 510K, you probably have some of that information, at least some of that preliminary information there.
I mean,
So
the whole premise of a 510K is demonstrating substantial equivalence to a product that's already been cleared for a specific indication for use, right? So this is a pretty important part of your pre-sub. And this is where labeling comes into play big time, all right? And we all think about labeling as whatever is on the package or that instructions for use. But labeling also includes your website, any promotional materials. What does your website say that your product does? That's part of your labeling. So this is where a lot of companies get tripped up and in a lot of trouble, frankly, because they're marketing indications that medical applications and indications that they didn't have clearance for.
Yep.
So this is a very problematic area for a lot of companies.
Yeah. Funny quick story. Kim Kardashian, 2 years ago or a year ago, posted after she had her most recent baby. I don't follow them, so I don't know what the names are. But she posted a Instagram post, a social media post about her using this lotion to reduce her cellulite. Okay, and she actually got into major trouble. The pharmaceutical company who creates that product, she did not disclose any of the adverse events associated with those type of topical drugs, and she basically had to repost that same post. And at the end of her, beautiful spiel about when I had a baby and I used this, it was great, she had to say this product may be associated with this, and this, because otherwise there was a regular, she could have been fined, or even worse, the company sponsoring her could have had a warning letter. So there's a lot of unique situations that this happens with, which is not a good thing. And it goes back to labeling, which just is not your physical label, but elsewhere. So pre-sub, we talked about device description, then intended use, indications for use, previous discussions or submission at the point of a pre-sub. This is usually going to be NA, not applicable. This is your first time contacting the agency. Again, if you're doing multiple pre-subs, which is not frequent, you might reference that within here, but most likely or most often, this section will be not applicable. The next section is overview of product development. So this is a catchy one, or a tricky one. So people always ask, what's the level of detail that we need to have in this section? Really, again, just to be practical, 1 or 2 pages of where you're at within your design and development process, while alluding to 21 CFR 82030 is very critical. Why do I say that? Let's say John and I are doing 2 pre-subs, and I come to the FDA and I say, we are currently doing prototyping stuff and we are going to be doing testing next week, and we hope to do final testing next year, versus John comes to the FDA and says, we have finished our phase 1 design inputs review. We're going into pre-design verification. We're doing design validation at the end of next month, and we intend to do our full design transfer meeting by the end of Q4 2016. Who's more credible, right? John, because he's referring to terms that the FDA is familiar with. He's referring to regulatory terms, design controls. So when you're writing a pre-sub, just like in a 510K, reference the proper terminology, okay? And that one in the product development section is maybe doing a snapshot of what your product development process, your PDP, looks like and where you are within that process. This is also a good place to put a little bit about your company. Now, here's where it gets a little dicey. You'll have 5 different consultants tell you 5 different things. I like to brag about board of directors, advisors. I like to basically put that in there, right? Again, this is a game. You want to establish credibility. So in that overview, product development overview, I'll start with a company description, launched in 2015. We're continuing on the process. Our board is comprised of XYZ who launched this company. We want to basically, again, FDA is not investors, right? But they want to know that you have a credible team behind you. So you'll hear some people say, I think that's a terrible idea. Just my opinion, right? What I do. But again, that's just something that, you can do.
What's the advisability of referencing sales and regulatory approval outside of the U.S.?
That's actually, no, it's
a great question.
John, I don't know if you want to address it, but I think it's very valuable.
I mean, to David's point, to your point, I mean, you're trying to show that, we know what we're doing. And, it's great that if you research this in college and that, you have that full body of knowledge and nobody knows more about this technology than you. But the fact that you can corroborate that story because you have medical advisors and you've already got clearance, CE mark in the EU, and it's already in use and been cleared by TGA in Australia and other parts of the world, that's great. And you've already got OUS, outside US clinical studies that have shown the safety and efficacy of the product. That's all part of your story.
That's such a good point that I'm
definitely
going to
bring it up.
That's such a good point that I'm going to stick that in there for my next time.
That's a good
I do this.
idea.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Yeah, I didn't put this in here.
It's a good question.
Yeah, and that happens often where it's a European company coming to US or vice versa. So, and then here also you want to list any literature. You can put that in your device description or your product development overview, but having a literature reference that describes kind of the scientific basis. Like for example, this is our company. We formed this company because there was some intellectual property at the University of Minnesota or UCSD that describe this mechanism of action. Again, it's all a story, right? Telling that story in this section is the key part. Now it's the most important part of the pre-sub, the specific questions, and I promised you more details on here, right? Typically, you want to target 5 to 10 questions. That's not a hard requirement. I've seen 20 questions, I've seen 2, right? So it really depends on the intent of your pre-sub. If you have a lot of technical questions, maybe you can even group them in one. But what you want to do is basically account for about 60 minutes worth of time for a meeting with the agency. That's their recommended time. I have not really seen a meeting that goes past that, okay? You want to categorize those questions by type. I usually do regulatory, product, technical, and then I'll do something like clinical or human factors if there's a lot of questions on human factors. Clarity is key, and we'll go through some examples of what that means. And then linkage of supporting information is also critical. What does that mean? So we've gone through the sections of a pre-sub, right? Product description, device description, intended use, previous submissions discussions, specific questions. After that specific questions section, there's one more section, and then there's the meat and potatoes of your presentation, essentially. And what I'd like to do is I'll ask a question. Does the FDA agree with the company's blah, blah, blah? Refer to section 7.5. And in 7.5, I will have all the details needed to support that question. Because questions should not be open-ended. You shouldn't be asking, for example, what do you think about this? Or tell me about what type of studies we should be doing. That's the type of question that's going to get you a very generic FDA response, such as, which I've seen before, the agency suggests that the applicant refer to FDA guidance, blah, 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 blah. That was a whole lot of money that you just wasted, right? So you want to have those questions tied to supporting information to help them make a decision to answer your question.
The other thing to keep in mind, remember we talked about earlier, what is the FDA's #1 job? What is their job? Anybody? Safety, protect consumers of healthcare products. And you say, hey, FDA, do you have any advice on what we should do from a clinical study standpoint? Careful what you ask for, because you may just get your question answered. So much so that FDA said, John, I'm glad you asked. We think you should do a pilot study in this patient population, and then you should do a multi-center study, even though you may not be technically required to because of a 510K type of product. If you're asking that kind of open-ended question, the FDA may answer it in a way that you don't like. So just keep that in mind.
Yeah, and that linkage, again, a lot of the stuff that I'm saying seems kind of like duh, but you'd be surprised how many times I've received like an RPM, a project manager saying, hey, you referenced this section, but it doesn't exist, or we don't have information enough to make a determination, so we suggest the applicant follow something general, and then you literally just drop because it defeats the purpose of your whole pre-sub. So let me go to, okay. So ask a question, right? You'd be surprised how many people actually say stuff instead of asking a question. Propose versus ask. If you're asleep or you need to wake up and you want to learn one thing today, it's propose. Your question should be framed as a proposal. Does the FDA agree with blah, blah, blah? Does the FDA have any feedback on blah, blah, blah? Versus, what do you think about, something general, okay? So always propose. Make them refute you, essentially. Questions must have supporting information. No product classifications. FDA is not going to answer your product classification questions there. There's a way of, getting indirect feedback on that, which we'll discuss. But really start your questions with things like, does the FDA agree with the following? Does the FDA have any comments, feedback, concerns with the following? And always avoid open-ended questions when possible.
And this is tricky, because why are we doing a pre-submission to begin with? Because we want the FDA to tell us, yes, you can submit a 510K, yes, you can use that as a predicate, yes, you can use this product code and that regulation. That's really what we're trying to get them to tell us, right?
Yeah.
So you got to be artful in the way you ask the questions in order to get the information that you're trying to get from the agency.
And here's some actual questions that I've used in the past. And you'll notice some of these seem general. But again, if you have, the question is not just the question, it's the supporting information. So let's take a look at one of them. Question, does the FDA agree with the planned usability human factors evaluation studies? Okay? So if I would have said, what usability and human factor studies should we do you think I would have gotten a good response? No, right? So I asked this question, and we put information that shows FDA that we know what human factors and usability is. We cited relevant standards, regulations, guidance, put a tabular format. Pictures and tabs and tables are the way to go in pre-subs. Concise information, right? People are used to reading tables. We showed them rationale for why the studies are being planned. Early results, we referenced some of our early results from a very rough study. And then we did a testing summary with the key information from the regulations. So that took about 2 or 3 pages for just this one question. But the FDA was able to reference that table, look at it and say, yeah, it actually looks appropriate. We suggest that you come back to us when you've come up with your protocols to review those. So that's the type of thing you want to do. Question and support that question. I'm going to skip this one because we go through it later on. A couple of don'ts. Don't use a pre-sub for medical device determination, product classification, or predicate selection. This actually is, I'd say, 50% of pre-subs. Again, anecdotally from talking to FDA reviewer friends of mine, try to basically make this a 513G where they're saying, hey, this is my product code, this is my category. Don't do that. You want to come to FDA with at least that information. Remember I said that in the beginning, there's a couple of things that you probably need to know at least. Don't ask bad questions. There are bad questions. I'm sorry. I'm not PC like that, but there are terrible questions that you can ask that don't add any value. We've gone through examples of some of them. And one of the things that is a big no-no, again, the logistics of a meeting with FDA is very critical. When you ask 5 questions, you'll have an opportunity to add or subtract anything after 28 days. But after that, you're done. Okay? There's no showing up to the meeting with 10 questions. That will not be received well. So what kind of bad questions exist? What testing should I do? What testing, yeah, that one was a bad question, period. Is my product code MAO? How many samples should I use for DV? This is one of my favorites. You hear this all the time, right? They're not going to tell you sample size. They're going to, now what they're going to do to answer you there is, we suggest that the applicant considers blah, 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 and point you to some standards. So again, remember, propose, not ask. Do I need to do a 510K? Not going to answer that. Do I need a quality management system? Those are the type of questions that they'll refer you to guidance or regulations. You should know your stuff before you do a pre-sub. Method of feedback and preferred dates is the last part of the pre-sub. What meeting type are you requesting? What dates and times? So let's go through those type of meeting types.
Well, let's just talk about it.
It's actually at the end. It's at the
Yeah,
end.
let's
Sorry.
yeah.
So anyway, that's the last part of your pre-sub. So notice that took, we only have about 10 slides left, but this was the bulk. It was preparing the information for the pre-submission. So let's just go through it again, just to refresh really quickly. In the pre-sub itself, what's first? Anybody remember? Let's go quickly.
Cover letter, I heard it.
Cover letter.
Yeah.
But before the cover letter, what actually should, maybe, again, not statutory requirement, but what do we recommend to do before the cover letter? CDRH cover sheet. CDRH cover sheet, cover letter. What's next?
3514.
Yeah, that's the first one, 3514.
Yeah.
Right. What's next? What's the first part of the content? Device. What's next after that? Once we've defined the device, what our predicates are potentially, blah, blah, blah. Intended use, indications for use, right? Signal to FDA, hey, we know what we're doing. What's next? Have we had any previous submissions or discussions with the FDA? Not applicable for most of you. What else? What's after that?
I heard questions.
Specific questions, right? That's the whole purpose of this meeting. And when the last thing is method of meeting. So basically, what type of meeting do you want to have? And then also requested dates, if it's in person or teleconference. And we'll go through that in the last part here. So once you submit that, and again, if you notice, we just talked about that for like 30 minutes. That can take a consultant a lot of time to put together if you're not ready, which goes back to the whole purpose of being ready for this meeting.
Yeah, just pretend like it's displaying.
What is going on with this thing? It's crazy. Anyway.
Now you can blame it on Windows. Right?
Don't use Windows. So once you have that ready, then you submit your pre-submission, okay? You submit everything we just talked about. The FDA has 14 days to do what's called an acceptance review, okay? So they have this checklist, refuse to accept checklist, that'll basically go through everything to say, is this a pre-sub? Should this be a pre-sub, okay? And once your application meets that criteria, you'll be either assigned a regulatory project manager or somebody to come to you and basically say, hey, we're ready to go. We accepted your submission of a pre-submission. So let's keep going. So there's a guidance in the guidance document, Appendix 2, Q-Sub acceptance checklist. It actually walks you through some of the questions that the reviewers will be asking. So you can actually go through that exercise yourself and say, has my type of Q-Sub been identified? Yep, pre-sub. It's in the cover letter. It's in the device description. Did we identify the type of Q-Sub based on the definitions? Yeah, we did that. So go through that Appendix 2 on your own. Make sure you've done that before you submit it.
And here's a tip. This is a key tip. This goes with your 510K. This goes with your Q-Subs as well. That checklist is being used by somebody at the Document Control Center or the reviewer or somebody at FDA. So why not give them your answers to that checklist? Why not fill that checklist out and point to where those items can be found on what page and in what section, and actually include that as part of your submission?
Yeah. Yep. So once you do that and you get the go-ahead, so people at FDA say, we got your stuff, and it is a pre-submission, congratulations, then there's 21 days to basically get the meeting scheduled. And again, this is from the start, okay? So that's day 21, essentially, to get that meeting scheduled. So your project manager will, if you called for a in-person, face-to-face meeting or a teleconference, they'll email you, they'll give you a meeting granted letter and say, when do you want to meet? Now, what I typically do is in the, like it says in the pre-sub content, I'll put together 3, 4, 5 different dates and times at work. That way they'll just come back to me and say, we're going to meet this day. That way you don't have to do it back and forth. It just eliminates some of the logistics.
And these are important because depending on what questions you're asking or technology, FDA, in all seriousness, they're trying to pull the right experts from their team. If you have questions about biocompatibility or sterilization or what have you, they're going to grab the experts from within the agency and have them available for this meeting. So, keep that in mind. If you have a lot of questions that require a lot of expertise from the agency, getting that date locked down within a reasonable time frame can be a little bit tricky. If you're asking for a biocompatibility expert and a sterilization expert and this expert and this expert, that ability to do that within that 90-day time frame may be a little bit challenging. You may be looking at more of 120 days. So keep that in mind as you formulate your questions.
Yep. So day 21, you get the meeting figured out. So now you're on the clock, right? You're on the calendar. And this is what a meeting granted letter looks like. So I redacted all the information, but morning, Mr. Moore. I'm the designated regulatory project manager for the product you recently submitted. I'm requesting a secure fax number. Your email wasn't secure. Remember I talked about that in the beginning, how important that is? That was my fault. I have to cop to that. And we accept your meeting request, and here's your formal acknowledgement of your meeting request letter. So then basically they start talking about what we're going to do moving forward for communications. So now for the first time, I have a face at FDA that's going to be reviewing my stuff. Now this person might not be the actual reviewer of my 510K, but often they'll be brought into the team since they first looked at your stuff. So that's the first communication you'll have, with somebody at the agency. This is really frustrating me. Okay.
Yes,
so,
question.
Go ahead. It actually is part of the explicit don't do that as part of the guidance, yeah. But there's tips to basically get that indirectly, because essentially what you're doing is if you ask the FDA, if you propose your regulatory strategy, like we plan to do, a typical question, question number 1, and a lot of my pre-subs is, the company intends to file a 510K with the following product code and the following predicates, blah, 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 and I'll put just a summary of the product code, the classification, the regulation number, the summary of information of why I believe that is the intended use, and then they'll give an answer back like, that sounds like a reasonable approach. Literally, that's what they can say. That sounds like the FDA agrees with that approach or believes that this is a reasonable approach. At that point, you've kind of indirectly confirmed your product code, you know what I'm saying? There's a game of playing there to figure that out, but you don't want to explicitly ask them, what is my device and what is my product code? Because it's literally, they say don't do that. So
FDA's job isn't to come up with your regulatory strategy.
Right.
They've got guidance documents, they've got the regulations, they've got all these product codes. Their expectation is that you review that, you determine the best course of action, and as David indicated, you're presenting that case to them, and they'll say, yes, we can see that makes sense. They may also say to you, have you considered X, Y, or Z? So they may broaden things a bit to get you thinking, but just to come out and say, hey, how are you going to classify, or what code should I use? They're not going to be your regulatory strategy resource.
Yep. They're looking for you to prove it, right? So this is the second most often asked question that I get for pre-subs is, what should I do? Should I do it in person? Should I do a written responses or should I do a teleconference? So I'm going to give you my opinion. This is purely opinion, okay? Because at this point, there's no real guidance around this. So in person, I like to do in person if the company's brand new, it's a really new type of device, it would really benefit from a show and tell, okay? That's when I really want to choose a in-person review. The cons are they take longer to schedule, typically, okay? They are limited time. You have 60 minutes, and that's pretty much it. So when you take away the intro and everything, you have about 40 minutes with the agency. And then they're also more costly. So to a startup, a few $1,000s of travel time to Washington is not a drop in the bucket. So that's the pros and cons for in-person. But in-person, the pros of establishing a relationship, having a face is, I like that a lot, right? The other option that I'm actually using a lot more now is written responses. So the pros to this are what I've seen, and again, this is anecdotal. You can have other people tell you other things, and I'd love to hear your feedback, John. But what I've seen is when I request from the FDA, hey, we don't need to meet in person, just respond to my questions in writing, it's a lot more comprehensive than just meeting with them for 60 minutes, right? The cons is you can't engage them in a debate in person, right? So you have to really use that. I kind of use that only when I'm really confident in the regulatory approach in my questions. The last one is kind of a mix, teleconference. It reduces some of the cost of travel. You get to meet with them, but you don't meet with them in person. So I very infrequently use teleconferences. I'll either kind of go black and white, in person or written responses. So that's really my recommendations. And again, there's so many other factors that contribute to that. That's my perspective. I don't know if you have any feedback to that, John.
No, I think that's good feedback.
So 28 days, day 28 is when you got the meeting request, you finish the agenda. Key tip, I usually have the agenda ready within the meeting request. I mean, it's pretty straightforward. I say we want to review these questions, these questions, these questions. It might change, and I'll tell you why. This is literally just, I snapped this from one of my pre-subs. Introduction 5 minutes, wrap up 5 minutes, that's 10 minutes gone, right? Review questions and responses to regulatory, CMC, non-clinical device development. I just kind of categorize them broadly. That way, when the FDA is gathering their troops, they know who needs to talk when. So that's kind of how I structure an agenda. Always structure it for 60 minutes. Although the guidance says you can extend 60 minutes, on rare occasions, just put it at 60. You're going to tick some people off who are very busy, right? Categorize the agenda with your questions, right? So if you pull my meeting request, the questions are going to be grouped by that same category. And then for in-person meetings, show and tell, save some time for show and tell, okay? About show and tell, and this is very important to me, and I'd love to hear your feedback on this, John. So this is a device I worked on, RemindTrack. It's a medication adherence product. So versus going to FDA with, again, this SLA product that can break, right? There's nothing worse, and I've had it happen to me, where the FDA reviewer is like, wow, this is fascinating, and the thing flies 10 yards away. That's not really optically a good thing to have. I mean, you can tell them all you want that it's a prototype, but that doesn't really jive well, right? So what I want to do is I don't want to show up with this thing. I want to show up with something that's a little bit more sexy, a little bit more, aesthetically pleasing. Never underestimate the importance of industrial design, okay? So this is something that I'm more comfortable showing. The key functionality, right? If I go back, if this is a digital health product, and I show them this pill box, and I'm telling them that this thing is eventually going to connect to Bluetooth, and it's going to tell you when you miss your medications, they're going to look at this thing and be like,
How?
what?
How in the world, David, is that going to happen?
It's a box. Don't BS me, man.
With some drawers.
Right. So then I come to them with this, though, and I'm like, look at this. Look at this. It's electronics. It's sexy. That is much more striking, right? So again, impressions, in-person show and tell impressions are very key. Looks like, feels like, very important. If you have a prototype that has half of the functionality that your eventual product will have, don't bring it. Just don't bring it, okay? Make sure it has, you want to use it for demonstration purposes. So, anything to add to that, or?
It's all good.
Should I become a model?
I don't know.
Was that good?
Maybe I should be, no, that's not going to work out.
No?
So.
I'll pass on that, yeah. Maybe somebody needs some
Question in the
overweight
back.
ones.
Well, more of a comment, thank you for that so far, the best part of my day.
Well, I appreciate it. I was a professional
David
dancer.
as a model is the best part of your day?
Man, I feel bad for you. I got to talk to you afterwards. All right, so that's day 28. You finalize that agenda. Day 60 is when you have to basically submit any additional information to your file. Hint, hint, try not to do it. It's a pain. It really is. And then before 90 days, and again, 90 days is kind of that end limit, but I've seen them actually extend past that, is when you have your actual meeting. So from time beginning, time to end, if you're really sharp, you could do it in 90 plus 2 weeks, 90 days and 2 weeks. That's a pretty conservative estimate for what it takes to do a pre-sub. Now, on the day of the meeting, here's a fun fact. The FDA tells you they're going to give you feedback 3 days before the meeting. You know how many times I've gotten feedback 3 days before the meeting? Once. You know when I usually get the feedback? The day before, when I'm at the hotel with my team prepping for the pre-sub. Okay? So now I almost build that in. I basically say, all right, hey, look, Sunday night, I try to schedule pre-subs on Mondays or Fridays. Sunday night or Thursday evenings, let's plan on 2 hours or 3 hours to go through the pre-sub responses. Because when you send them the pre-sub, they're not going to just wait to give you information at the meeting. They're going to respond fully to your pre-sub, and then you're going to review that information in the pre-sub meeting. So what they're going to do is they're going to send you back information. Your project manager is going to say, Mr. Moore, please review the responses to your questions. And they're going to ask you a very funny question. They're going to say, you still think we need that meeting tomorrow, or can we cancel it? Because they are trying to really eliminate resources, right? They don't want to be in a meeting that they don't need, worth it. So frankly, if you get back your responses and they're fully answered, you're great, you can cancel the meeting. But if you've traveled all the way to DC, you're probably going to want to hold that meeting for the personal relationship, right? But they'll ask you whether you still want to have the meeting or not. So what I typically do is respond to the project manager. Again, everything is about relationship and making sure that I use my time wisely. And let's say I had 10 questions and I felt, after talking to my team, that 6 of them were answered pretty well. I'm going to tell her, you know what? We only need to focus on these 4 remaining questions, okay? So let's change the agenda and let's just focus on these 4 questions. It's great because I get to focus on the stuff that I don't have maybe the confidence in. So that's something that happens 3 days, quote unquote, prior to your meeting. But honestly, in practicality, I've had consultants, other friends of mine tell me that they do get it in 3 days, so I might just be unlucky, but I typically get it the day before. So yeah, that's prior to the meeting. And this is what you'll get. You'll get an email, something like this saying, hey, please find the preliminary comments for the sponsor meeting at 2:30. If we are proceeding with the meeting, please identify the items you'd like to discuss further. So you'll get that information through email, okay? And if you'll notice, again, I wasn't lying. What day was our meeting? January 19th. And when did I receive that? January 18th. So FDA, if you're looking on YouTube, I still love you, but sometimes, if you could get that to me better, that'd be great. So anyway.
Or in true engineering fashion, put some plus or minus, put some tolerance around it. 3 days plus or minus 2 days, right, David? So
yeah, right. Margins. So here's an actual question and response. So remember I told you that they don't tell you your regulatory strategy is, yep, you're going to do a 510K, you're going to do this. A 505B2 in the drug world is kind of like a 510K, roughly. Don't quote me on that because that's terrible, but it's roughly like that. So I asked that question, does FDA agree with the proposed product being submitted be this pathway? Cross-referencing is kind of like using this predicate. And the response was, yeah, that'd be an acceptable approach at this time based on the information provided. So if I didn't provide any information, they're going to tell you, we don't know. So I provide like 2 or 3 pages worth of information, okay? So the cool thing also about doing this pre-sub process is, let's say you don't know any FDA guidances or regulations, half of their response will be references to other guidances and stuff that you should know while preparing for a 510K. This is a little bit more of an in-depth response. So we asked them a question about design development, and they gave back some really good feedback. So if you take a look at this is what's fascinating about this process. I mean, they're telling you, it's unclear what the function of this is, so you should clearly explain that function, right? Goes back to the reason that I ask companies to do a system architecture diagram. They'll even give you tips on testing. Hey, you probably want to do a peak injection force testing through clothing, right? So that can get as detailed as this type of response. I've seen responses be pages long, right? So you can imagine as an R&D engineer, you're like salivating. You're saying, oh my God, I have somebody from FDA telling me what I should do, that's like a dream, if you think about it, right? You're de-risking a lot of your test data because of that. So that's always a great part of the meeting. So the meeting itself, right? Let's say you're doing an in-person meeting or a teleconference. We're going to focus on in-person. Act as if it's a job interview. Be punctual, dress appropriately, use the proper manners. We're all adults in professional careers. We don't need to be told that. Bring ID. You'd be surprised at how many times I've heard, I've never experienced this, but I've heard of people not bringing their IDs. They're not let in the building, okay? Coordinate with your project manager about timing for arrival. Again, a lot of these things sound silly, but there's such a dance here. If you arrive too early, you can maybe potentially upset your RPM who's in a meeting saying, oh, I got these guys here, they've been here for an hour, I gotta go get them, blah, 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 they're early. This actually happens. These conversations have happened. So make sure you come, the FDA usually recommends 30 minutes early. It's that important that it's in the guidance document. It's 30 or 15, I think it's 30. Take notes of attendees and functional roles with FDA. So if they don't volunteer this information, they most likely will. But if at the meeting you sit down, it's kind of intimidating sometimes. If it's your first time, you'll have a whole panel, depending on what your product is. And if they don't volunteer who they are, they usually will. Make sure you ask them, because as you go through the meeting, you want to target the device people who are working on the device mechanics, the biocompatibility people. You want to identify them by name and address them. Take detailed notes, and the number one hint or tip, it sounds silly, but it's really critical, designate a lead. I have been in meetings myself before I was doing these, solo as a consultant, where the company was fighting amongst each other in front of the FDA. Like basically imagine if John and I were saying like, if I said, yeah, it's actually 30
David,
days.
That's not what we did.
Yeah, but we, no, yeah, so it's 30 days, and I think that type of conversation doesn't look great, right? So designate a lead, and what the lead typically looks like is like that, right? So it's Mr. T. No, I'm kidding. But the lead, actually, let me fast forward here. Let's say I'm the lead for a, I kind of look like Mr. T if I was out of shape.
You needed that gold chain, and you'd be good to go, I think.
I'm Cuban, so that works with me. So, okay. So I'm the lead for this pre-sub, right? And what I want to do is I'm going to tell my team who's traveled with me, I'm going to say, John, you shut up. No, I'm not going to say you shut up. I'm saying, I'm going to defer to you when I have questions that I can't handle on R&D. I'm going to defer to you, Robin, on clinical. I'm going to defer to whoever else on something else. So I'll have designees, okay? So I'll have, for example, I'll refer to an R&D person. I'll say, to address that question, I'm going to turn it over to, Chris, blah, 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 or John, or Tom, or whatever, to address that question or those comments. And we'll plan out. We'll have like a pre-meeting planning session so that, John knows when I go, he knows it's time for him to take over. And I'm not kidding about this. Like sometimes I'll plan out like, hey, when I look at you and I say something like this, I'd like for you to respond to that. So having that lead is really critical, because having a single point of contact, the Spock principle, is really great because it streamlines the process. And as a consultant, it's my job to make sure this thing goes well. So always designate those leads like that. Who do I bring to a meeting? You want to bring the A team, right? You want to bring who is actually involved in the pre-sub writing, who can answer tough questions. Like, so for example, my expertise is not, cytotoxicity studies. But if cytotoxicity studies are a key part of my pre-sub questions, I'm probably going to either find a consultant who can help there, or the person who I've been working for, or the person in my company who's been doing the cytotox studies, okay? Something that they won't tell you, another thing is I'll bring a head honcho, like a big kahuna. Like, so, for example, if I had Elon Musk on my board of my medical device company, I might bring Elon Musk to my pre-sub meeting. He might not say a word, okay? But just having somebody like that in my meeting lends credibility to the team. And again, this is a dance. This is a story, right? You want to have somebody powerful like that in your corner. So if you can afford it, bring the A team. Don't bring more than 5 to 6 people, okay? Unless it's a really comprehensive, like PMA 100-day meeting or something like that, because otherwise it becomes too diluted. So that's the key. Bring the A team and identify a single point of contact.
Another really important point is sometimes, especially if you're a startup and that inventor of that technology is very proud of this technology. It's a baby of his or hers. That person may want to just tell that story, right? And every time that the FDA has a question, may take it a little personal, might get a little upset because something that the agency's asking they want to defend their position. You have to do a lot of coaching with those people because this isn't that technology isn't being put on trial.
Yep.
Right? The agency is trying to gather information. So that inventor, entrepreneur, if it's his or her technology, they just need to be made aware of, maybe now's not the time to try to be vocal and defend it. Maybe now's the time to chew on your tongue a little bit and take the coaching from your lead. So just keep that in mind.
Yep. And then a couple last things about the meeting. Stick to the script. Do not change the intent of the meeting. Add questions. That's a very good way of getting slap on the wrist. Don't argue, but you can challenge the agency. I have challenged reviewers in the past by citing regulations and standards that they might not have been aware of. So you can do that. Just make sure that it's based in objective evidence and not subjective evidence. And then one thing that I do often is if there's a critical, again, I told you guys about that testing, right, where it saved the company about $1 million. If that's very critical to you, you want to repeat that back to the agency after they give you a response and say, from my understanding of this conversation, it seems like you are indicating this, this, and this, and make sure that's reflected in the meeting minutes. So we talked about the team. So the meeting happens. This is what's going to happen next. This is kind of the tail end of this part, right? The regulatory project manager will most likely say, hey, can you get me those meeting minutes, before a couple of weeks? I send them out within like a couple of days, right? It's fresh. I review the meeting minutes. So I often won't take meeting minutes because I want to focus as the lead on the team, but I'll have a scribe or someone on the team taking those detailed meeting minutes, okay? And then I will compile them. I'll make sure it's based on the written responses we got, and I will send that. That's why I like to have meetings on Friday, because I'll finish them up on the weekend and send them on Monday, okay? Okay, that's just my own personal preference. So those meeting minutes should be detailed, but they're not a script. They really shouldn't be like a verb by word script. Summarize the key points. Something I like to do in the meeting minutes is make sure that even if I've notated the minutes, just put like at the bottom, key takeaways, right? Always submit to FDA within a few days. Don't wait for the full 2 weeks to do that. And then what FDA will do is they'll receive it, and then they'll kind of regurgitate it internally, and they'll submit a final version of those meeting minutes in 30 days. My experience, it's usually in that 30-day time frame, and you don't get that like a week later. At that point, it's very important to review those meeting minutes, make sure that they are accurate, okay? There is a dispute mechanism for minutes. I've had to use it once. It's not fun, so just make sure that your meeting minutes are accurate and that their meeting minutes are accurate, okay? Very, very key. That meeting minutes is like the holy grail of the pre-sub. It shows all of that stuff we just spent an hour and a half talking about, that it was completed, it was done effectively, and that's what you can use now to raise money, to de-risk your process. All of that information is boiling down into a couple of pages, and your written responses to your pre-sub. So last few things here. After the pre-sub, you'll still probably continue talking to your regulatory project manager. The cool thing, again, a lot of secondary privileges come out of doing this pre-sub, which is why it boggles my mind that people aren't doing this as much. But basically, you can get FDA to actually say, hey, we really like this product. We really want it to be successful. Send us your test data before you do submission, or before you do a protocol or you launch this usability test. Let me see that, right? And I don't see that too often. It happened in January with this last pre-sub where they asked for a lot of information, which seems bad, but it's fantastic. You basically get like this pre-review of submission stuff. So as you can imagine, that's kind of like a perk of going through this process. And then always react accordingly, right? If the FDA told you to do something with your testing, even if they gave you bad feedback, and that happens, you get information. I mean, 80% of pre-subs that I go through, there's always going to be one question that we don't get an answer we don't like, that we like. So you know what? We react accordingly. We'll change our test plans, do whatever we need to do to satisfy what the agency has. But the bottom line is do what the FDA wants you to do.
And on that point, I mean, think about it. If FDA says, why don't you consider following this guidance document, or why don't you consider following this standard? Hint, that's probably going to be pretty important to that submission at some point.
Yeah.
They're telling you, they're giving you an answer that's important. A couple of you asked me some questions, very specific questions about very specific situations. And David and I are here for the next few days. So feel free to grab us at any point in time. You know, you're here to obviously meet other med device professionals, but you're also here, you all came with a whole list of questions about quality systems and regulatory submissions and what's a design input versus a design output, and how do I capture my risk management, and what's the difference between EN ISO 14971 2012 and ISO 14971 2007. All those types of questions, people like David, people like myself, we'll do our best to answer every single one of those questions. So, and it's encouraged to buy us. David likes single malt scotch, and I'm kind of an IPA fan, so that usually helps as well. I'm kidding, not kidding, you decide. So see, I told you, I said scotch, and his ears perk up. So my job now is to take all of that information, or at least enough of that information from what David just went through, from kind of the down in the trenches. I mean, you just got $10,000, all right, $5,000 worth of free consulting from the David Amore on a pre-submission, okay? If you were to hire him to come into your facility to teach that, I don't know what he charges, but you got a lot of value from that session, all right? So it was a lot to consume, a lot to soak in. The good news is, you'll get the slides, you'll be able to watch the video, so you'll be able to refer to this over and over and over again. Now, the good news is, I'm going to go through an example. All right, so I've changed enough of the information from, this is a real example of a real pre-submission for a real technology, but I've changed enough of the identifying information to where, obviously, to protect the secret sauce, so to speak. So I want to go through and I'm going to describe what that case study is all about. We'll do a brief review of pre-submission contents again. Go through that table of contents. And I'll share with you enough information about what we included in that pre-submission. I'm not going to give you the answers to every single thing, but it's more for discussion purposes. And again, this is a real situation. So, no, the company's name is not Amazing Device. That's for dramatic effect. But I'll let you all read this. But the gist is this company is developing a device. Hang on, here we go. A device that's a smartphone, and it's going to take certain vital signs data from a patient that's wearing, or an end user that's wearing a device. You imagine that you got something like a Fitbit that you're wearing and it's recording heart rate or other vital signs. This is a hot area in the med device space these days, and this is one of those gray zones where, is this a medical device? Depends on what you indicate it for. Depends on what you claim your product does. But there's a lot of wearables that are kind of on that fringe. They're kind of in this gray zone. And this is an example where it's a little bit in the gray zone. So imagine your end user is the person with the bow tie. And this person is wearing the wearable device, has their smartphone, and that smartphone is collecting data and information from that wearable technology. It's going to take that data and it's going to push it to the cloud, right, where there are servers. And those servers are going to contain an algorithm, a custom algorithm, the Amazing Device company's secret sauce. They're going to extract these signals from these wearable technologies, and they're going to put it through this algorithm in a way that's going to push information to the patient or end user's EMR, electronic medical record, and also push that information to the physician. The physician is going to receive that information, and depending on what is contained in that data and what the algorithm determined, going to make treatment recommendations, prescribe different modes of treatment, okay? Pretty generic, pretty common. But this is what this technology is doing. Everybody understand kind of that flow of information? Any questions so far? All right. And the good news is I know this is an audience that's going to ask questions as you have them because you did such a fantastic job in the first part, so thank you for that. Like I said, David and I can speak for days if you let us, and we have, yeah. In fact, if you want to check out a 2-part series, how long was that? The design control was like 3 or 4 hours worth of David and I talking. And if you want to learn how to get that, for free, we've got a 3-hour course that you can consume on demand anytime. Just find me later, and I'll be sure to let you know how to get that. As David, this is a little bit of a review. David talked about the pre-submission contents. Here we go. The same table of contents, and let's dive into some of the details. So we saw an example from David, but here's that cover letter. There's a form. The thing about a letter is that just like with the 510K, this letter is going to look pretty similar. Same format. Create these as templates within your organization and use the consistent format, font, template, letterhead, all these sorts of things become important. It's part of your story, not only for this product, but for all future submissions. David also mentioned Form 3514. This is the pre-submission cover sheet form. This is, and I've copied different sections of it because a lot of it is not applicable when you're going through a pre-submission. But you'll see in that upper right-hand corner, or I guess, yeah, your right-hand corner, the request for feedback, the pre-submission box is checked. I list the date. Here's the benefit. We didn't even talk about this. Anybody have any idea of how much it costs to do a pre-submission? Yeah. About $2,000. Any other guesses? Anybody? 0. You don't have to pay for a pre-submission to the FDA. It is free. And that's like shocking to me because you're getting FDA expertise. Like if you were to submit like a 510K, you would have to, I don't remember, but let's call it $5,000.
At least $3,500 for small businesses, yeah.
So for pre-submission, it doesn't cost you anything to the FDA. Now, it does cost you time, your resources, and so on, but you don't have to pay a fee for the FDA for a pre-submission. So that's a nice little perk.
In the spirit of transparency, too, just because a lot of you are probably wondering, what does it take to hire a consultant to do this? Again, the ranges are varied, right? Some people out there charge like $500 an hour. I think that's criminal, but it's okay. You're talking about, at the very least, anywhere from $10,000 to $30,000 to get somebody to prepare a pre-submission for you. If it's really straightforward and can be done pretty quickly, a few $1,000s even, and especially after learning today, hopefully, you go back with this PowerPoint, you do a lot of the work yourself, even less. So those are just some, I hate when people say it depends, so I'll give you at least some ranges for you to think of as you go through it. So
yeah, that's a pretty reasonable range. So. All right, so this form, how many of you have filled out 3514 before? Anybody? No. Here's a couple other tips. There are some weird things about FDA forms from time to time. How many of you are using Firefox or Chrome or Safari as your browser? Anybody using those? Who still uses Internet Explorer? Well, the good news is when you go to FDA and you want to download these forms, you still need to use Internet Explorer. If you do not use Internet Explorer to access these forms, it will say, please wait, ... and you'll never get the form. I know, it's antiquated. For those of you, I know this exists with Chrome. You can get an extension where you can open in Chrome, but open it as an IE tab. That's a free extension, but just keep that in mind. It can be frustrating if you're trying to find FDA Form 3514 and you're using something other than Internet Explorer as your browser. You're not going to open the form. Just a tip.
So Edge, no good either?
I can't confirm or deny about Edge. I don't have any experience with Edge. I don't know. The good news is Yeah, well, I don't know, good news, bad news. Let's just say FDA isn't always up to speed with the times when it comes to technology always, so just keep that in mind. So I don't know what version of IE they're on, but I doubt that they're on Edge, but I don't know that. But just know this, if you get the please wait whenever you think that you got the form 3514, you might have a browser issue, so just keep that in mind. Don't get too frustrated. So section B is just some basic information. It's about your company. This is you. You may not be established as an entity yet. You may be an unknown. You may be that startup, and that's okay. You do not have to have your establishment registration number in order to have a pre-submission with the FDA. But do fill out your contact information. So do provide that. Now, this is a new section, Section C. If you are using the great David Amore as your consulting resource, or John Spear, or anybody else for that matter, do communicate that on this form as well. And so Section C is actually for other correspondents that may be involved in working with you on this. All right, so Section D doesn't apply to a pre-submission. Don't worry about it. It's okay if it's blank. Section D2 also.
I wanted to mention one thing because actually it's one of those logistics things that can become a nightmare. So up until fairly recently, probably a couple years ago, I used to hide behind the scenes with a lot of submission work, and that's because it actually, most companies often didn't want to have a consultant present the information or work with the agency directly. So if you are using a consultant, make sure that you have some sort of contract or contractual agreement that limits their responsibilities in terms of, let's say you fire them in the future, right? That they can't communicate with the agency and try to, again, not that they would, but you never know. So make sure that those contractual agreements and things are in place prior to doing that. And you also find, if you plan to do a pre-sub by yourself, you might find that like for example, I sometimes will go to companies and the companies will say, hey, my young, quality engineer wants to, have her name on a 510K. Can she do it instead? And I don't care. So I'll be on the background a lot of times on those things. So that's acceptable. You don't have to have a consultant all the time, but if you do, make sure that their scope of responsibilities is agreed to and contracted. Sorry.
No, it's a really good point. So
yeah.
Section D1, you can even say it says reason for application, PMA, PDP, HDE. Hey, none of those are pre-submission, so ignore. Section D2, reason for application, IDE, also not a pre-submission, ignore. And I know, you want to fill it out and you want to mark NA or you want to put a line through it and all those sorts of things. It's okay. It really is. This is not the time to worry about that. You fill out the sections that do apply to you. Section D3, reason for submission, 510K. Again, this is a pre-submission. We're not submitting a 510K with this submission. So Section D3, ignore as well. Section E, I know, I'm going through all this. We barely filled out anything on this form. But again, it's about, remember, why are we doing this? Why are we filling out Form 3514? Because there's nothing available for pre-submissions. There's some truth to that. But what are we? Yeah. We're conditioning not only ourselves, but conditioning FDA. We're getting them thinking, they're using the forms that we've put out there. They're using our guidances. They're using all of these templates that we've spent so many taxpayer dollars creating and putting in place. So, but it's really about trying to frame not only our own internal organization, but also the regulatory agencies that we're eventually going to be moving toward an additional type of submission. So we're going to use this type of form. Now, Section E, additional information on 510K submissions. Doesn't apply where it's not a 510K. All right, so Section F. Notice now it says this is applicable to all applications. And so now you're starting to speak about the thing that you're going to include as part of your pre-submission. And in our case, we're referring to the amazing device, Home Health Data Analyzer. It's a cute name. If anybody wants to use that name for your technology, feel free. There's no trademark. There's nothing about that. I just made it up for this example. So if you want to apply that, you can send me the royalties. If you need my address, let me know where to send the residuals. I'd be happy to take that. But feel free to use the HHDA in your own product. All right. So remember a little bit ago when David talked about the regulation and the product code and that information. This is going to start to find its way into this form as well. So you can see in section G, you're going to identify what you think that product code is based on your regulatory strategy. This is not a section to leave blank at the point in time of your pre-submission. So you want to actually fill out this information to your best knowledge based on the data and information that you have at that moment in time. This can change depending on how the discussion goes with the agent. I'm not even touching it, I promise. With the agency, this could evolve over a course of time, but you will identify your indications. This will be important not only for your labeling, but this is going to help frame the context. This is going to help FDA understand how the information that you're presenting as part of this pre-sub is going to basically structure that entire conversation that you want to have with them. Standards, all right, so you may, this particular standard, utilization of standards, you may not have completed this particular section at the time of your pre-submission. It's really what have you done? Like maybe you have already done IEC 60601 testing at the time of your pre-submission and you've applied that standard. If so, then you might reference that. But if you haven't, then that's okay too. So go ahead. All right, so we talked a little bit ago about the importance of your device description. And I use slightly different words, but the gist is the same. We want to illustrate and communicate what it is that we're doing and why it is important. All right, so we want to paint a picture. Go ahead, David. We want to talk about what it is that this product is doing. And I'm going to pause for a moment and let you all read this wonderful description of the amazing device, Home Health Data Analyzer. But as I described earlier, I think you'll start to get this picture, what it is that we're trying to do. Again, this is your story. This is the information that you want to communicate to the agency so they understand what it is that you're trying to do. All right? Go ahead. And, this could be a little bit of a narrative, and it's great to be able to reinforce what it is that you're doing with real pictures and images and charts and graphs and tables. Put it and break it up. Don't just have it a giant wall of text. Page after page after page of text. Who likes to read pages and pages and pages of text? All right, I do. But anyway, most people do not, all right? Most people, I don't know what the current attention span of a human, but I've got a 17-year-old and a 14-year-old, and based on my data from them, I would say it's about 3 seconds. So I keep that in mind as you're writing, as you're trying to communicate. Those pictures, those charts, those graphs, those tables break up, but keep the reader's attention as they're reading through this information. So it shouldn't just be random pictures. It should be appropriate, but do build that in as you're describing this. Like, a little cheesy, granted, I get that. But this is a picture that, you all have some perspective on what this product does based on this picture. You understand that somebody's going to be wearing a device. That device is going to communicate with their smartphone. It's going to push data to the cloud. That data is then going to be pushed to the EMR. It's then going to be pushed to my doctor. The doctor is going to look at that information and determine what kind of treatment I should be getting. Do I need to eat more fruits and vegetables? Do I need to exercise more? Do I need to go on triglyceride medication? Do I need to take some medication for heart condition? Whatever the case may be, That's the basic flow. And, that's a pretty clear picture, but I can even go even further. I can show, actual screenshots if I had them from my device. I can talk a little bit more about the science behind the algorithm, because if you remember, the data that the amazing device company is pushing to the cloud is taking the native file or the native format from the wearable, and it's putting it through some sort of algorithm. Well, what about the algorithm? How is it? Is this proprietary? Is it custom? What is the science behind that? So go ahead. The other thing that I think is important, David talked to you about 820-30, design controls. I don't know if you're all experts in the topic of design controls, but I'm pretty passionate about design controls. Some might even say I'm a design control nerd, and I know David is. He and I've we've just had conversations for no reason at all other than just to talk about design controls. But this is a pretty important thing. Design controls, the whole idea of the technology that you're designing, that you're developing, is to, number one, you're trying to improve the quality of life in some way, shape, or form. You're trying to help people out. The other thing that you're trying to do is, or that I hope you're trying to do, crossing my fingers that you're all doing this, is making sure that the devices you're developing are safe. How do you know if they're safe? Because, should I just take your word for it? Because you say so? Well, I'm sure you're all trusting people. But there's this little saying, in God we trust, all others bring data. And design controls is data. It's information. It corroborates the story that you're trying to tell. It demonstrates that your product is safe. And, I don't know about you, but as a medical device product developer, safety is one level, but I also want to make sure that the thing that I'm developing is effective. Safety and effective. Safe and effective, right? And I'm sure that that's the way all of you are wired. So design controls is the foundation to demonstrate that. It starts in all of these points, and if it's redundant to what David said, great. Because there's a study, and I think I learned once that 82% of all statistics are made up on the spot. But there's this element of we have to keep hearing things over and over and over again. The study I heard was the average human has to hear something 7 times before it actually starts to resonate with them. I'm sure you're all above average humans. So David said it earlier, and I said it today. So you might only have to hear it twice. And the good news is if you need to hear it more times, the medical devices group will make this information available to you because you pay great money to be here, and you'll get to watch it 7, 8, 12 times if you need to. But the point is, everything that you're doing is about showing that this product is going to be safe and effective. It starts with those indications for use. It starts with that intended use. From there, you build user stories, user needs. How does the product interact with the physician, the patient, and so on and so forth. From there, you start to define your design inputs. Engineers love design inputs. Remind me again, how many of you are engineers? Engineers love design inputs, right? All of you love design inputs. These are the requirements. What does this thing have to do? It's where the fun stuff happens. It's where we like to build prototypes. And then from there, you start to capture the design outputs. I like to use the analogy that design outputs, it's like the recipe. It describes all the ingredients for your medical device. And then the important verification comes in. Verification proves that that recipe meets those requirements. I know you guys, this is you all know this, right? And validation shows that the product meets the user needs. But this is so important to your pre-submission. So important. And David mentioned sharing that information. If you're that startup and this is the first time that you've done this, that's great. I applaud you for embracing this approach. It's recommended to include your reference to your product development process. Maybe you'll list the procedures. David shared with you how you need to have qualified suppliers that are a part of that process. you may want to make reference to that procedure. Do you need a full quality system at the time of a pre-submission? No, but you better have your design control process defined and that you're following it. You better have risk management defined, and you better be following that. You better have supplier processes defined and following those. And you need to be able to demonstrate that to the agency. All right, go ahead. So, materials used in the device. Now, this is a great question that was asked a little bit ago. If maybe my product incorporates polycarbonate. I don't know exactly whether I'm going to get the DuPont polycarb or I'm going to get the Dow Corning polycarb, but I I'm going to use polycarbonate. So be as specific as you possibly can. The other side of it is you may want to be a little bit more generic where you can. So specificity is important where you need to be specific, but describe what is involved in this thing. Are you using, like in our case, the device, the HHDA device, isn't something that I necessarily hold in my hand. I mean, I'm not going to invent a new smartphone for this amazing device, home health data analyzer. I'm going to write a smartphone application, right? The smartphone application is now part of my device. I also mentioned as part of our description of our product that we've got a cloud server. We've got an algorithm that's going to interpret this data that's coming from this wearable technology. Well, that's now part of my device. I didn't create new hardware as part of this technology, but I'm also leveraging hardware. I'm leveraging wearable devices. They're not mine, but I'm leveraging them and the data that's coming from them. So this is what's interesting in this moment in time, this age that we're in. Historically, we used to think of a device as a tangible thing that you hold. But that's not the era that we're in. I mean, yes, of course, there's still the catheters, there's still the needles, there are still the tangible devices. But the definition of medical device is evolving so rapidly these days. All right, go ahead. This is kind of the who cares. Why is this needed? Why does the world need a technology that takes data from a wearable device or a product that a person is wearing in their everyday lives, extrapolating that data, taking it through some sort of algorithm, and pushing it to my doctor? Why in the world do we need something like that? Do we? Explain the clinical utility behind it. Explain why this is important. Okay? It might be that you want to save, the alternative is I go to my doctor once a year for a physical, but I'm a male, and I can speak pretty honestly based on this survey of other males that I've talked to. Males hate going to the doctor. I'm pretty sure females do too, but I know for a fact males hate going to the doctor. But you get to a certain age, and there are certain tests that are pretty important that you have to go through as a male. And I'm not quite there yet, but some of my friends that have had those tests, they tell me it's a good time. And I'm hoping to avoid that as much as possible. You can use your imagination to whatever those tests are. But anyway, point being, medical adherence, going and seeing our doctors, it's a hassle. I got to take a day off work. I got to schedule something. It's just a pain, So what if by wearing something like, that looks like a watch, maybe even tells time and a lot of other things, maybe I can read my text messages and do my email. What if through doing something like that it can communicate to my physician in real time, but over a period of time, the state of my health based on certain vital signs? That might be pretty attractive, right? Maybe I only go to see the doctor. Maybe I never have to see the doctor. Maybe the doctor prescribes treatments for me based on that data ahead of time. Maybe we can actually become more proactive about our health than reactive. Anyway, I felt like I was on a soapbox for a moment, so I'll step off. But go ahead to the next slide. You did such a good job. They're not asking me any questions, David, so thank you.
I know the question you wanted me to ask you, so I'm not going to.
Okay.
About your exam, so.
All right, great. All right, so predicate comparison. All right, so I'll give you the disclaimer first. For illustrative purposes, I found a few things that, close enough. I have no idea. Actually, I actually read about one of the products, the Scanadu Scout. I actually read that they actually were going down this path. They actually had a Kickstarter campaign with the FDA to raise money. They actually did that, and so on and so forth. And they were going down a path to get this product cleared through the FDA, and then they've pulled back on that process, and they're actually shutting that down. So keep that in mind as we go through this. These are just for illustration purposes. But I found a few technologies. I have no idea if I'm saying this correctly, but we're going to say Tinke device, and it comes in both the Android and the iOS platform. But it's an application that allows me to measure some of the vital signs, and so that was one of the predicates that we came across. And so when I put together my pre-submission, I want to talk about what my product does. I want to talk about what my product does with respect to predicates. So for those of you, remind me again, how many of you have worked on 510K submissions? All right, so a handful or so. A big part, all right, so the premise behind a 510K is to demonstrate substantial equivalence. You're demonstrating substantial equivalence to predicate technologies. This is also a point in time in a pre-submission. It's one of those conditioning things. Think like a 510K. Get the reviewer thinking like a 510K. So having predicates included as part of your pre-submission, good idea, because guess what? When you get to the point of a 510K, you're going to have predicates. I would recommend even for those of you that have constructed one, great. If not, grab David, grab myself. We can give you some tips and pointers. But you can also go find 510K summaries from the FDA for these technologies. Like if Tinke was a real medical device that had a submission for the 510K, you can go search for that on the FDA website. You can see their predicate descriptions and what technologies they compared with. It's a wonderful world that we live in, and how much information you can get for free with just a simple search. You can identify this information, but start to build this predicate comparison. I would encourage you, again, a great place to put a table. Show how your product is similar to these other devices, but also show where there are things that are different, and be ready to explain why it's different. All right, go ahead.
Yeah, and actually just a quick point to that. It used to be that, so for example, if I identified a predicate that I really liked that was a target for my product, I would have to either submit a request letter to the company itself requesting their full 510K that's redacted, or I'd have to submit a Freedom of Information Act through the FDA. And the last time I submitted a FOIA request through FDA was a few years back, and somebody called me from their office and said, well, this is going to take quite a long time, and they have up to 3 years to give that to you. So that used to be a pain, and you had to figure out, actually some of the stuff I based my predicate on was how much information was publicly available that I can use, which kind of stinks if you think about it, right? So most recently though, and this is why I want to share this with you, if you're not aware, when you go to the 510K lookup part of FDA.gov, there's now a little box that says redacted FOIA, and basically you can look, or full 510K, you can look for full 510Ks now that are redacted by product code. So for example, for the first time in the most recent pre-sub that I'm doing, submission that I'm doing, I put in my product code FPA, and I clicked full 510K available, and found 6 full 510Ks. So not just the summaries like John was saying, but the actual full 510Ks that were submitted. Now obviously there's a lot of redacted information in there, like for any support of IP or any proprietary information. But as you guys, to take away from this, I really want you to be aware of this ability to now look up 510Ks that are full 510Ks, not just the summaries, which is extremely useful for everybody. So I just wanted to mention that.
That information is gold. I mean, anytime you can find what somebody else has done in your product space or your technology or the type of code, you can identify what testing that they did is going to be invaluable to you, because we're trying to de-risk everything that we're doing from a regulatory perspective. We're trying to identify our path forward with as minimal obstacles as possible. And if I can look at a full 510K that has already been cleared by the FDA, and it was cleared, let's say, within the last couple of years, the good news is that's probably pretty consistent with current FDA thinking on that topic. Question?
Sort of substantive position.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. So the gist is, so far what I'm sharing with you about the amazing device, and if I misstate this, please correct what I misstate, but the basic gist is I'm talking about a device that's going to take, it's basically software. It doesn't use any hardware, but it's going to take data and communicate that. But so far, the couple of items that I've shared with you, or at least one of them, is the actual hardware itself. So how do I make that claim? How do I make that argument, per se? And so if we go to like the next, go ahead to the next slide, one before that.
Oh.
This is sort of yet another twist on it, because this now incorporates the wearable component of what we're doing. I'm not making the wearable. So this is where the twists and turns happen in the pre-submission process. I'm trying to tell my story. I'm trying to communicate what I want to do. I'm trying to share with you and the FDA and the world eventually why my device, why my product, why my technology is the best thing since sliced bread. And I'm going to convince you through this argument or this dissertation. I think somebody said something earlier. It's kind of like defending a master's thesis. Yeah, there's some corollaries to that for sure, but I'm trying to tell you a story, and I want you at the end of this to say, I like your story, where do I sign up? And so part of my story is, especially when it comes to the predicate technology, because if there was something that was clear-cut, absolute, same type of technology, same modality, same point of view, or indications for use, you know what? Maybe I don't need to put together a pre-submission. If it's so cut and dry, so black and white, then I might not need to go through this path. The reason for the pre-submission is where there are things that are a little gray. They're a little, I don't know. And so in my case, I'm trying to build the story. I'm trying to say, well, there's this thing over here that does part of what I want to do. There's this thing here that does part of what I want to do. There's this thing here that does yet another part. And I'm trying to build the case and tell the story for there are instances, there's basically precedents where FDA has cleared these other indications or these other products for parts of what I'm trying to do. So by transitive property, if you add this, this, and this, and put it into my product, then it should work. You know, so it's a rationale. You're just trying to build that case, build the business case. And so then I go through all that, and then I come up with, you know, the indications and intended use statement. And again, this is an important thing because these words that you say here will be the basis for every regulatory decision from here on out from the agency, because these words dictate and determine what product regulation applied to your technology. These words will determine what product code. Remember that example that David showed for the one regulation? I don't remember the number off the top of my head, but let's call it 880.2444, whatever. And there were 15 different three-letter product codes. Each one of those product codes has a slight twist. They all fit under the same regulation, but the product code, every single device gets assigned a product code. Now, we won't talk about de novos today, but that's a whole different 3-day seminar. But the gist is that your technology that you're developing will be assigned a product code. That product code fits within a regulation. And it's all, when it comes down to it, it's based on what you claim your device does. So that's why those words are important. All right, in this case, we didn't have any previous discussions or interactions with the agency, but if we had, we would describe when those were. If there was another Q-sub or another 510K or another regulatory filing or submission that we would reference, we would list that and include that. Again, we're giving the FDA a heads up. Here's other places that you can go where we've talked about this thing in the past. And then, what do we do from a product development standpoint? And this is In my experience, there's kind of a couple parts of this. This is what we have done. This is what we have documented, and this is where my little soapbox rant about design controls is important. Because if you're not using terms and terminology and phrases that are familiar to the agency, they speak 82030. They may not speak whatever language it is that you're communicating to them. So my advice to you, align with 820.30. There's a waterfall diagram when it comes to design controls. It's pretty clear. And if you want a little bit of help making sure that your processes align to 820.30, grab David, grab myself. We'll be happy to get you on the right path. But do yourself a favor. Align with what the regulations are. The good news is 1345, 2016, guess what? It's almost one for one with FDA quality system regulations. I know many of you probably have quality systems in place that address 1345 and FDA. Well, the 2016 is going to make your life a little bit easier. So you can actually build the business case from a design and development, from a design control standpoint, and be in a much better position. So, but describe what it is that you're doing. Non-clinical testing, what did you do from a design verification standpoint, from a bench testing, from a performance testing? Did you test any particular industry standards? All these sorts of things become part of this explanation from a product development standpoint. Did you do an animal study? Animal study is non-clinical, so describe what it is that you did, and just tell that story. Just explain, because you're trying to corroborate. You're trying to basically demonstrate that your plan, your mode of attack, your ideas behind this HHDA technology, this new amazing device that you're developing, and compared to these other technologies, is as good and as safe as anything that's already out there. So tell your story. Now, also talk about clinical. If you're planning to do clinical studies, then you should provide a little bit of an explanation, a little bit of a rationale of what those things that you plan to do. And if you don't plan to do anything, that's fine too. Now, keep in mind, this is where David's advice to you about the way you ask the question. Don't come out and say, I don't know, what does the agency do? Does the agency think that we should do a clinical investigation? Because they may come back and say, hey, John, that's a great idea. I'm glad you suggested it. So we think that you should do an IDE submission, and we think that you should do a pilot study, and we think you should do this, and we think you should do that. So just beware about that. Whenever you ask, you will get an answer. So how you ask the question is important. And if you don't want the answer to the question, I'm not going to say that they're not going to come back and say this, but just it's very important. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But if you plan to do a non-significant risk clinical investigation, let them know. We believe this is a non-invasive, non-significant risk. Hey, did you all know FDA has a guidance document on significant risk versus non-significant risk devices? If you didn't know that, there is a guidance. FDA has it. It's pretty decent, actually. It's pretty clear. You can read through it and you can have an understanding of this thing that I want to investigate. Would FDA consider it significant risk, or would they consider it non-significant risk? So use that information as well. The good news is if you determine through this analysis that it's non-significant risk and so on, then that's a good document to actually cite. And if you're going to talk about doing a non-significant risk clinical investigation in your pre-submission, it's probably good to cite, well, we use the FDA guidance document, and based on the information that's there, we determined, and we also talked to an IDE and an IRB at the hospital down the road where the study is going to be conducted, and the IRB also agreed that it was non-significant risk. So be prepared to tell your story, but to support it with evidence. All right, so here's where the fun part happens, and these are the questions. Remember, I know David said we can't ask it this way, but I want to know, what is the FDA, how are they going to classify my product? I want to know, is a 510K going to be okay? Will they accept my 510K? I want to know, hey, when I send you all this information, will you give me clearance in 90 days? Right? Don't we all want to know this? I mean, we want to predict the future of our medical technology. I don't want to enter into this do loop where things keep happening and things keep going over and I never know when the end's going to happen. I want to know with certainty that this regulation and this product code applies to my product and that the FDA is going to accept that. But I can't ask that. I have to be somewhat creative. So I'm not suggesting creative writing, but the engineers probably don't come up with the questions because engineers will ask things in a very, matter of fact sort of way. I am an engineer. All right, I go to therapy 3 times a week. I am an engineer. Okay, it's okay. But let's read through some of these questions. Like the first one. Amazing device believes, based on the rationale and evidence provided for the HHDA device, that 21 CFR 870 2300 cardiac monitor is applicable. The company plans to submit a traditional 510K. Does FDA have any comments on this approach? So again, as David pointed out earlier, I would point to the sections of where that information would be contained within this pre-submission. But do you all see there's a little bit of art to how you ask that question? They asked you all the questions.
Yeah, I think
So, and I know we're kind of wrapping up toward the end anyway, but a couple other questions. Based on the proposed indications for use, we plan to use this device and this device and this device as predicates in the 510K submission. So again, you're corroborating that story. You described how all these things are similar. You probably had a table that shared the similarities, talked about the differences. So you're leading the FDA where you want them to go with your questions. All right? We can go ahead to the next slide. So again, David shared with you, there's kind of 3 ways to do this, solicit this feedback. You can do it through written format. You can do it through a teleconference. You can do it through face-to-face. And there are pros and cons to each of these. I won't beat that up again. David did a good job of sharing that with you. But do keep in mind, when you submit your pre-submission, you need to identify, I want a face-to-face, or we're going to do this as a teleconference, or whatever the case may be. Go ahead. And just, again, I want to remind you, it's not rocket science. It is a prescriptive format, and I would encourage you to, it doesn't have to be David, it doesn't have to be me, but find somebody who has put together a pre-submission before if this is your first time, even if it's just an extra set of eyes to look it over and make sure that, hey, that this is an argument, this is the rationale, this content of this pre-submission is appropriate and applicable to submit to the agency. So, just a couple more minutes. I'm glad you all paid great attention and asked fantastic questions. And there might be a couple more fantastic questions in the audience. So while we have a few more minutes today, anybody have any questions for David or for myself? Yeah, well, the question is, how do you know if there is even a predicate device out there? And that's this is the as an engineer, I want to invent something that's never been done before. From a regulatory perspective, that's problematic. So this is the biggest, this is the multi-million-dollar question that so many device companies are faced with. FDA has defined, I don't remember the exact number, but let's call it hundreds of different regulations based on specific type and use of products. So it's your job to do the due diligence and make sure, or to review and see what regulations exist. And you may identify 4 or 5 different regulations that apply to your technology, and you just need to keep digging and keep digging and keep digging until you've done what you believe as an exhaustive search as possible to determine whether or not there is a predicate device. It's not easy, it takes time, and FDA is not going to do your homework. You got to do it. If you need a guide on how to do product classification, I got one. see me and I'll send it to you. It can walk you through that step by step. Any other questions?
All right, we got maybe one or two last questions, and then we'll wrap. So you're never going to see, one thing that's really good is you'll never see like subjective information within a response. It's actually, they are very careful. That's why it takes a while to prepare the responses, and why often you'll get it a day before instead of 3 days before, is because they have to make sure that everything they say is in accordance with a specific regulation, citation, and standard. So there's actually people internal to the FDA that review, responses for those reasons. So the short answer is, it's very infrequent that I see like a very subjective answer. A lot of subjectivity comes based on an objective answer. So for instance, like you might get something I got recently was, please establish these reliability metrics based on this specific standards. The reliability metrics are to demonstrate that this product can be repeated. It's more subjective to show during the submission that, it helps them understand a concept. So it's a good question, but often it's very much based in in that information. One real quick thing to that though is a good way to hedge your the nuanced responses that you get is you can request certain reviewers in your pre-sub. So for like a lot of pre-subs, I'll put a table together saying I'd like to see this CDRH representative, this division head. They're not I probably put like 10 names, they're probably going to come back with maybe 3 or 4 that can attend. But that's one way for you to get the proper subject matter expertise that you need in your response. So I think with that, or unless you have something else, John, but I think with that we'll wrap up. We only have like about a minute left, and we want to give everyone some time for lunch and everything else. So I appreciate your guys' time. So I hope that this was helpful. My job today with John was to convince you of the validity and usefulness of a pre-sub. Hopefully we have done that. You can take what we've kind of taught you today and really take a stab at it yourself. Really, it's not that complex. And maybe have somebody review it if you'd like that big gentleman in the background as well. He's a good pre-sub guy to talk to. So yeah, I mean, that's really what we wanted to take away. So if you step away with A, pre-subs are good, not terrible, and B, I think I know what a pre-sub is, I think we're good. So I think with that, we can wrap. And like I said, we'll be around here, and if you need to have any chats with us about your specific products, including all you IVD manufacturers, where the heck did you come from? Because there's like a specific aspect of pre-subs for IVDs that we didn't touch upon too much, then I'll be around to chat with you. So
seriously, thanks for the questions. It's been a great discussion. I appreciate your attention. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.